I don't recall the last time I was in a cinema as packed as my screening of Barbie, and I don't think I've ever been in one so overwhelmingly female, and so overwhelmingly pink and sparkly, so festooned with glitter and tiaras and all the stock adornments of a plastic princess. For a film and a director very much opposed to gender-based binary constructs and hierarchical systems and sexualized cliché, and this is true of both film and director, as we will see.
Well, it most certainly is a feminist film.
To me, it's like that's like one slice of the pie. Like it's
pretty big.
It's a big slice, but like
this effect might cause some discomfort for the creators, but on a meta level, it's perfect. Barbie is such an inconsistent, hypocritical mess that it deserves only to be treated ironically. To me, it is staggering that a film into which a lot of thought was genuinely put could at the same time have been so lacking in self-awareness, but I am a man, and men are autistically attached to things like sense and consistency. If you think it's sexist to suggest that women are not, well, you're probably taking issue with Barbie, not with me. Barbie disdains stereotypes while playing up too very many of them. And make no mistake, this is a girls' film. Or, more accurately, it's a film for women and those aspiring or growing into womanhood. Besides a few bored-looking boyfriends, I was one of the few people there not wearing pink. You could probably have held the theatre's combined total of testicles in one hand, if you're into that sort of thing. Not mine, though. That's a two-hand job. Women being an alien species, it felt a bit like living on an occupied Earth, where our strange new masters have taken over our infrastructure and put it to their own nefarious and potentially genocidal purposes. My world is dead. This new culture is strange and cheap and regrettable. Oppenheimer was playing on the screen next door. The nuclear bomb was a wonderful and dangerous achievement that ushered in a forced peace, a kind of subatomic stability. Immensely world-shatteringly destructive, but quite widely available, it ensured that Armageddon would be a mutual affair. The destruction it offered was egalitarian and equitable. The same, however, is not true of women. Women possess immense and unique destructive power. If all the schedules in my cinema were to sync, the atoms would collide and split. The ladies would have fused into one monstrous Hydra creature that even Godzilla could not have stood against. It's doubtful whether the world could have survived such an event. Men are essentially powerless to stop firepower of this magnitude. We're saved because, whatever their public masquerade, whatever projections they make, whatever totalitarian systems of oppression they place their externalized frustrations on, the people who really hate women and seek to subjugate them are almost invariably other women. They invent many comforting myths to distract from this eternal truth. The patriarchy, institutional sexism, male chauvinism, toxic masculinity, but really, the greatest impediment to the matriarchy is the sisterhood, and men can only sit quietly hoping that this maxim holds. There's a reason our far-sighted Chinese cousins threw so many baby girls down the wells during the one-child years. They feared the day womankind woke up and united under one banner. Should we regret not doing the same ourselves? Time will tell. If anything, Barbie is a source of hope. To be sure, the potential for matriarchal genocide is there, but beneath that is more evidence of the error bred in the bone of every woman. Barbie doesn't think very highly of men, to be sure, but it doesn't like females much either. Women make up half or more of the population in most developed countries, so they have only themselves to blame for their perceived oppression by the masculine minority. If they did all band together and vote as one, abortion could be available at an ATM. The women's soccer team could be paid equally to the men's, which is to say astronomically more than the men when measured against the revenue they generate. Equal pay for equal work really could mean equal pay for doing less work. Any given cause of the feminist fashionistas would be instantly achieved, and the fact they remain frustratingly out of reach is the fault of women for being blind to their own power, not of men, who are generally much more honest in blaming each other. Much as the old left claimed to speak for a working class they secretly despised, the feminist pretense is that women are bedeviled by a false consciousness that prevents them understanding their own best interests. That is, ironically, one of the most misogynistic attitudes it's acceptable to hold. Women are not one block. There is no magic to be found in vaginas. Their social and political attitudes are formed by experience, not sex. And if you have a problem with any of that, you also have a problem with Barbie, because Barbie semi-realizes this same point. It does have one or two things to say against lazy feminist assumptions, even if it has rather more to say against a patriarchy that is long dead, if it ever truly existed. It's not an uncomplicated feminist screed. It is in fact not always that interested in feminism. If it has an ideology, and I don't think it really does, that ideology sits somewhere between late-stage and post-feminism. It's bored of some of the old tropes and arguments.
I actually, when I got asked the other day, like, is Barbie a feminist? I was like, well, She's actually like the level up from that, because if you look at Barbie Land at the beginning, like the Barbies are on top and the Kens are kind of disregarded. So I was like, well, that's not equal.
No, right.
So
right.
whatever the opposite of misogynist is, actually Barbie's like. So towards the end, when they balance things out, then it might be feminist. But actually, it's like beyond feminist.
The fact it's emerged as an incomprehensible mess is that it can't delineate between arguments and assumptions. For every feminist trope it nominally discards, there are 5 or 6 that it assumes are mere facts of life, shirking the labels and keeping the content. And these serve as anchors that weigh the film down and prevent it taking off with that most important of things, an alternative. Because Barbie doesn't really have anything to say.
I think it belongs to the film because I think it's because when we were making it, the whole Barbie is like an icon that, as Margot was speaking to, that it's both. She exists in the both and, not the either or. She's not either good or bad, or is that diving into the complexity of it and not running away from it, but like looking at all the thorniness and stepping into it, and also looking at all the thorniness and stepping into what
spit it out.
What is the negotiation of what women need to be?
Well, that was a waste of time.
This is what's causing so many wild and widely diverging takes from critics. Ben Shapiro is on the right. He argues that it's a woke catastrophe. Ethan Van Sciver is, I think, on the right. He argues that it isn't. Grace Randolph is on the left. She says it represents all the thoughts inside her head, which is shocking, as until now I'd always assumed she didn't have those. Based Gandalf would be considered on the right. He says it's a woke disasterscape. Brendan O'Neill considers himself on the left. He would call Based Gandalf a snowflake. There will be other people on the left who will argue that Barbie is too corporatist and insufficiently progressive, but they haven't quite finished their 200,000-word intersectional treatises arguing against Barbie from a genderqueer, body-positive Marxist perspective yet. There will be Twitch streamers who make this point as though they've thought of it themselves, but they can't do that until someone else has formed the opinions that they are going to parrot. Because people, mostly men but also the better women, fundamentally want the world and everything in it to make sense, this confusion has inevitably become a debate over premises. Is Barbie a feminist screed in a clever but unconventional way, or is it a satire of woke feminism? Is it upholding woke standards, or is it critiquing them? Does it hate men, or does it hate women who hate men? Or does it hate men who hate women who hate men, or women who hate men who hate women who hate men? The answer is all and none of these things, as we will shortly see. Barbie has half-thoughts and semi-realizations that lead it to quasi-satirize certain assumptions, but the half it doesn't think or realize prevents it from following satire through to anything like a conclusion, making much of it indistinguishable from farce and from parody. Reviewers attempting to read ideology onto Barbie are doomed to fail because Barbie doesn't really have one. It has half of one. It's amorphous and intangible, and nobody, from its creators to its critics, can get a good hold of it. It knows what it's against, it doesn't have much of an idea about what it's for. Sidge and Adam's conversation on it is probably the most interesting because they don't typically fall into this trap. Sidge's take on the film's fixation of motherhood is especially interesting, and we'll come on to that in more detail a bit later. And Adam is right in that the film is something of a Rorschach test, I think for the reasons I've just laid out. The link to that video is in the description. It's not their fault that the conversation inevitably spends more time on the politics than on the film itself, as I am already doing. That's because so much of the film is about its messaging, which makes it doubly frustrating that it lacks a positive, identifiable message. There really isn't much film to speak of beneath the theme in Barbie. It subordinates all the major components of craft, story and world building first and foremost, to its theme. The other major component, character, isn't so much subordinated to theme as it is subsumed by it. All the nominal characters are there to populate and represent theme, not plot. Their progression through the world is meant to illustrate a point that isn't really a point to begin with. The film's message to men and women is simply, in the end, be yourself. The question follows, okay, but what does that mean? And to that, the film has no answer. The best way to show that is to do the usual thing and break it down accordingly. I've got a bunch of family stuff on at the moment, so my eternal thanks to the lovely Bagface and Oski for their help in putting this video together. They are both worth checking out. The links to their channels are in the description. And speaking of things worth checking out, a word from my sponsor. Have you ever wanted to be the best there ever was? Well, tough, you can't because I exist. But if you want to claim second place for your own, you should try Pocket Champs. It's a free-to-download mobile game that lets you take one of these cute but pitifully weak little critters and train it up to be a champion athlete. Some people think you have to go to the gym to train, but you don't. Smart people train champs to compete on their behalf. Be like smart people. Fair warning though, some of these guys will need quite a lot of training. How you train them is up to you. It's up to you to pick the best training regime and the best strategy to win. Planning, working, choosing the right perks and gadgets, that is your job. When the race begins, they're on their own. It's just the little guy you've trained versus a bunch of other little guys trained by other people who you want to beat. You just sit back and watch as your good work does or doesn't pay off. Look at this little weakling. This is what I had to work with at the start. See how he loses to all the other players? And now look at him. He swims faster than a surfboard. Surfboards are for cowards. Look at his glorious bird. I gave him that bird. Picking the right gadget for the race is vitally important. You don't bring a turtle to a tiger race, for instance, you fool. Pocket Champs is updated monthly with new items, gadgets, costumes, and locales. What do I like about the game? Winning, obviously. Otherwise, what is the point? I've partnered with Pocket Champs to offer you guys a starter pack with 1,100 gems. That's worth around $9.99, but they're only available for a limited time. So make sure you click the link in my description or scan the QR code to download Pocket Champs. Gems will automatically be added to your account. It won't be enough to beat me, but at least it'll make you a bit more of a challenge. With that said, let's get on with it. I want to start with some praise. You might think that being saturated in pink would be like being force-fed bad acid and getting locked in your little sister's bedroom, an horrific experience worthy only of a cluster headache and several decades worth of trauma. But it's not. The film's aesthetic style, even if it's not your cup of vodka, is remarkable. Greta Gerwig has some considerable talent where this stuff is concerned, and so do her cinematographers. She takes a keen interest in her cinematic forebears, and will wax lyrical about the influence Woody Allen had on her, for example.
Now she's sharing her thoughts on director Woody Allen. The filmmaker and actress worked with the director on 2012's To Rome with Love, and she says she regrets it. Allen is embroiled in allegations of sexual misconduct.
Oh, never mind, then.
And Barbie is chock full of references to the romance of film history, both in text and on the screen, making it predictably odd that Gerwig will later shit on people for taking an interest in these same things. The opening shot is one such example, a play on 2001: A Space Odyssey with a voiceover from Helen Mirren, the film's seldom deployed narrator. Rather than apes mulling around with sticks and stones, we get little girls playing with dolls. Mirren explains that for as long as there have been little girls, there have been dolls, but initially, these were just baby dolls, allowing girls to play at being mothers and very little else. Then, like the monolith from Kubrick's film, Margot Robbie's Barbie arrives on the scene, accompanied by Strauss's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, with an analogous effect on the little girl apes around her. They begin smashing their dolls as Helen Mirren explains that Barbie changed everything. Here we get our first Rorschach test, and the introduction of a theme on which the film will never be anything but hazy. Gerwig knows, or at any rate she ought to know, the symbolic meaning behind 2001's opening scene, which doesn't just depict the ape acquiring knowledge, but also his first use of that knowledge, that facet that defines the human as distinct from the animal kingdom, deliberate, conscious violence. Weaponry. The analogy the film is drawing is with motherhood and the desirability thereof. So the writers will look, and has looked, at the opening scene and say, what about the feminist attack on the mothers? They're teaching little girls to kill babies, they cry. Here's how I can relate it all to abortion. The leftist, by contrast, looks and has looked at the opening and said, hey, this represents the freeing of women from the shackles of a restrictive ideal. Girls can aspire to more than just motherhood. Freeing women from these notions doesn't mean they hate children and mothers, but now they can choose to be mothers or not. But at this point, the leftist and the rightist aren't critiquing the actual theme, they're extrapolating from the theme and reducing the result to the arguments they are presently obsessed with. The film isn't that easily reducible. Motherhood plays a persistent thematic role throughout, and it's not always a negative one by any means. It doesn't always say, kill the babies. Gerwig herself is a mother. We're going to have a brief and abortive, that was a pun, a brief and abortive sub-arc between a mother and a daughter that is all about intergenerational healing and a familial peacemaking, and that doesn't conform to the rightist's read of the opening scene. Then again, we're also going to be told that what's important isn't objects or possessions or love and family, but rather finding yourself, which at least strains against the mother-daughter sub-arc. Helen Mirren continues to narrate the glamorized history of the Barbie doll and its supposedly liberating effects on female aspirations. Barbie begins as a standard identikit model, but quickly branches out, becoming a doll with her own house, her own car, her pick of any one of numerous high-status careers. Ain't aspiration wonderful? Women's liberation for the win, so says the leftist. This was and has long been the argument for positive representation in media. Girls need role models, you see. Role models who encourage them to broaden their horizons. It was a justification for expanding the Barbie range to begin with. It's the argument that's been made for Lego providing more options for girls. It's the reason we now suffer the girl boss entertainment trope. Girls need to see themselves in important positions, and Barbie led the way. Except, of course, that Helen Mirren then says, with barely concealed sardonic irony, that thanks to Barbie, all problems of feminism and equal rights have been solved. Here then is the film attacking what was, until 5 minutes ago, a feminist and broader leftist shibboleth. Because these problems have not been solved. Representation has not achieved the successes sold in its sales prospectus, and the film is aware of the fact, so, you see, it's satirizing feminism. Or is it? The narration ends, and we get our first look at the Barbies in the Barbie land. It's visually striking, it's hellish to my eyes, but hellish with a point and a deliberateness to it. Again, props to Gerwig and her team for leaning fully into the hyper-surrealism of girls' dreams. We see the Barbies in their wall-less pink dream houses, smiling and waving happily at each other, showering without water, walking on fake plastic pools, flying off rooftops because, as Helen Mirren explains, when you're playing with Barbies, you don't go to the trouble of walking them down the stairs, you just pick them up, and you put them where you want them. Essentially, what we're watching is a day in the life of a Barbie being played with by a young girl. Or so we think, and so the film thinks for the moment. It's creative, innovative, it's well shot, it's fairly humorous, accompanied by the first of many set-piece songs that in this instance is deliberately trite and cheap. A lot of stereotypical girl music is just like this, but Gerwig has a narrative use for stereotype, and it's at its strongest during the first 20 or so minutes, before the film begins to grapple with reality, which is when things begin to really fall apart. We get a slight hint of the problems to come, though. Helen Mirren explains that the mechanics of Barbie World are predicated on the imagination, read young girls' imaginations, which more or less confirms, without necessarily meaning to, that young girls don't really have much of that, at least by boys' standards, because if all we see here is the result of girls' imaginations, and we're shortly to learn that these Barbies are, in a vague and inconsistent way, being played with by girls in the real world, then we're led to believe that little girls imagine everything as pink and weightless and fundamentally uninteresting. The Barbies just make house, they say nice things to each other, they dress prettily, they have house parties, they think little, they achieve less. This despite holding all the positions of power. Besides Midge, whom Helen Mirren encourages the camera away from because she's pregnant, and Mattel discontinued her because pregnant dolls are weird, the rest of the Barbies are shown in various professions, from builders to journalists and the president of Barbie Land itself, yet nothing actually occurs. The builders aren't building anything. The president's press conference simply has her telling the assembled Barbies to turn to the Barbie next to them and say nice, vague things to each other, and so on. The problems here then are thematic and mechanical, and inevitably these two things are linked. Of the mechanical, we will shortly learn of the link between the Barbies' antics here and their playful masters in the real world, and yet there are so few of them. This problem recurs in much larger ways later, not least when the film discards this entire setup, but for the moment, a one-to-one link between doll and owner requires a vastly bigger world than we are shown, one with much more variety than we're shown. That last aspect of the mechanical fault is born of the thematic one, which is a critique of girls themselves that the film is fairly but not completely aware of. It wants to convey that mere representation has not solved the problems of the real world, but this manifests in an implicit attack on girls' paucity of imagination. This is slightly ironic, and feminism generally has been known to complain that we don't value girls' predilections and interests as highly as we do boys, while at the same time arguing that those predilections and interests as do exist are the undesirable product of socialization. We shouldn't value working in oil derrick more than we value teachers or therapists, but it's bad that girls are socialized into wanting to cook and clean and teach and talk about feelings all the goddamn time. Gerwig's vision of Barbie World isn't the uncomplicated attack on men and masculinity some have suggested, not yet anyway. The film is going to go on to make a point of the injustice handed out to the Kens in this matriarchal world of Barbie Land, but it does buy into the questionable and dehumanizing belief that sex differences in play, habit, and in imagination are the result of social forces that need to be overturned, rather than at least partially innate psychology. To say that girls only want to go into teaching because that's what society demands of them is basically to say that you don't value teaching as highly, which belief, by the way, requires that almost every culture, or on every continent for the entire history of mankind, has socialized boys and girls in almost exactly the same ways. The film makes Barbie World an expression of girls' imaginations, and it finds those imaginations wanting. It's a critique of children that justifies itself by pinning the blame on nebulous societal models. This is what I mean when I say that Gerwig's thematic messaging is incoherent. It does move beyond specific feminist shibboleths, but it also carries in a great many of them as assumptions. And the idea that a child's state of nature prior to outside influence is a blank slate is one such assumption. The irony of telling people they shouldn't be defined by other people's ideals about them is that you're doing that too, Greta, and carrying an immense amount of ideological baggage as you do it. None of this, of course, is immediately apparent to the demographic the film was marketed at, because if you'd watched the trailers, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is a standard, fun, family-friendly caper with familiar icons paraded around the screen in a colourful setting, something like the Super Mario movie, for example. But much of the film is not and cannot be apparent to that target demographic either, because having seen President Barbie and Nobel Prize-winning Barbie, we move to Body Positivity Barbie presenting a case at the Barbie Supreme Court, in which she explains that Citizens United doesn't exist in this world. Corporations are not people, they have no speech rights. Attempts to argue the opposite are attempts to turn democracy into plutocracy, and all the children clapped. See why keeping filmic and political analysis is so fucking hard with this film? The most you can really say for the former is that this scene is utterly incomprehensible to the audience the trailer was marketed at. But even that is bordering on political analysis because it immediately begs the question, so why is it in the film? And you can't answer that question without engaging in political analysis. They did it because the adults in the room would understand it. And should children happen to ask what it was all about, the adult can then explain it, meaning a child who doesn't know the first thing about First Amendment jurisprudence will grow up socialized into having a particular political position. And I have to point out again that a huge chunk of the film is about repudiating exactly that thing. Make your goddamn mind up, Greta. The film is chock full of references no child and precious few adults would understand. We've had our 2001 reference, we'll get references to Proust Barbie, Monty Python's Holy Grail, The Godfather, West Side Story, plentiful double entendres like the Kens promising to beach each other off, which pissed Ben Shapiro off to no end, at least 10 references to patriarchy and patriarchal systems, references to fascism, to capitalism, to beauty standards, to sugar daddies, Michelangelo's Creation of Adam, and a reference to political activist sloganeering against a bill denying farm workers the right to strike. No, I'm not making that up, it's really in the film. Some of these references are good, all of them though are annoying. They're annoying because they're playing on what can be, what should be, a valuable aspect of filmmaking, and one we actually need much more of, things that go over kids' heads. Beaching you off is a good example. When later on the Kens start threatening, "I'll beat you off,"
if I wasn't severely injured, I would beat you off right now, Ken.
I'll beach off with you any day, Ken.
Anyone who wants to beach him off has to beach me off first.
I will beach both of you off at the same time.
Beach both of us off?
Nobody's gonna beach anyone off.
Moral Puritans like Shapiro read that as an incredibly overt and risque gay joke that's unsuitable for children, omitting, of course, that children aren't going to get that reference unless it is subsequently explained to them. That's parental rights, if you will. Double entendre is the cheapest example, and there's a long history of it in kids' entertainment. Pokemon is full of them, and I guarantee you didn't get them when you were 10.
It's a girl? Oh yeah, you're right about that.
She can violate my rights if...
Hey! He says no, but I have crabbies.
I haven't seen this many strange letters since the last time I placed a personal ad.
Already? We're blasting off prematurely!
Flame that lights the night, a flame that shadows the darkness.
That outfit, where'd he get it?
I think that costume came right out of his closet.
Been having some trouble.
So prescribe us some ointment on the double.
To protect us from all that chafing and itching.
It might finally stop all of Jesse's complaining.
Of the rest, there's immense value in having certain parts of films and stories for kids that require the parents to explain them, because kids are idiots and they need to be educated, and parents are better placed to do that than the screen itself is, not least because it gives parents agency in choosing what and how much to explain to their child and in what way. Ideally, these are optional extra details in a script that doesn't detract from the viewing experience. As in some of the better examples above, a kid doesn't need to know the provenance of the horse riding scene, Monty Python's Holy Grail, to think that it looks funny. The parent can explain that later, or put that film on later, which they should, because Monty Python's Holy Grail is excellent. Writers of books, TV, and film have immense power in spurring children's interests. They can dictate a line of questioning. And yes, inevitably now I have to say,
with great power comes great responsibility.
There's a difference between a double entendre only a parent will understand, or references to Proust or West Side Story, and the script imploring the parents, please explain to your kid why you're clapping about overturning Citizens United. One encourages education, the other encourages indoctrination on a bill the parents themselves probably don't understand much better than their children do. In a child's mind, you have an entire, surprisingly long scene, which is essentially incomprehensible. It's very difficult to explain that scene to a child without, in effect, imbuing them with prejudice in one direction or another, and likely in one direction over the other, given the context, given everybody applauds the fact in universe, and given the type of person likely to go to see the film to begin with. I think Greta Gerwig is fairly intelligent, and she does seem to understand the role that she's playing here, even as she fudges the distinction. When she was asked in an interview about the adult references in the film, she said, "I've never had such a sharp delineation in my mind between things that were made for adults and things that were made for children. I had parents who blessedly took me to and showed me lots of things, and sometimes there was even a double pleasure in things that were beyond me, because it felt like a window into a world I was just starting to piece together. I always liked that feeling, so I thought it didn't seem like a hindrance to a younger audience enjoying it," which is a fudge, since there's a difference between having sly remarks and rare references to things only adults can understand, and having a ton of references and even entire scenes that only adults of a certain persuasion will understand and agree with. There is a difference between things made for adults and for children, even within the context of a kid's film. That difference is what gives the parent their agency. But hey, no, socialization is bad, remember? We're going to go on to learn that later. Except for here though, here it's very good. Good one, gotcha Greta. The beat you off scene comes next. As Barbie comes back from applauding the attack on Citizens United, "Platoon, why are you criticizing a kid's film?" and goes to the beach, where we run into Kens. Lots of Kens, but also Ken Prime, played by Ryan Gosling, Beach Ken. Helen Mirren explains that every day is a good day for Barbie, but for Ken, a day is only good if Barbie looks at him. That's because the film is quite consciously mirroring the patriarchy here and throughout, and showing how a matriarchy is as bad for the men as the patriarchy is for women. Oh, did I say is for women? No, I meant as bad as the patriarchy was for women. The parallel is artificial, not current or even particularly satirical. The film is mirroring its conception of the total patriarchy that it believes existed many decades ago, an assumption it runs with to make a few interesting points, but really just a whole load more uninteresting and irrelevant ones, because it's not criticizing something that's real. We're shortly to go to the real 21st century world as this film imagines it, though it's going to be portrayed with a kind of lightweight hyper-reality that undermines the distinction between the two realms, where the patriarchy this film pretends to mirror just doesn't exist, meaning the reflection is off by a factor of generations. In Barbie world, Kens are second-class citizens, just like the film believes that women are in this one. They do nothing. They exist purely for the pleasure of the Barbies. They only appear on the odd occasion the Barbies need them for some rare reason. Our Barbie, Margot Robbie's Barbie, stereotypical Barbie, STB, we'll go with that, STB, she doesn't have feelings for our Ken. Gosling's Ken, Beach Ken, highlight of the film Ken Prime. So he spends much of his life here desperate to impress her and just miserable at his failures. He decides to try and impress her by showing off his surfing skills, but he bounces off the water because he isn't Surfer Ken, he's just Beach Ken. Beach is his one and only thing. Injured, he gets mocked by the other Kens, particularly Simu Liu's Ken, because he's in this film. That's really all there is to say about him. And they start threatening to beach each other off until they're pulled apart by the Barbies. The film continues to make excellent use of its various visual references, by the way. The entire thing is brilliantly distinctive, and it happily and diegetically brings in various established Barbie toys and sets, as in this scene, when one of the Barbies wheels out the Barbie hospital in which Ken is to be treated. There's something a little bit Wes Anderson about a number of the set pieces, and if you can ignore the film's theme and message, which is to say, on the very rare occasion the film allows you a couple of minutes without injecting more of it directly into your eyeballs with a needle the size of a sledgehammer, it's worth taking that opportunity to appreciate the genuine talent on display. Greta Gerwig's, of course, but the cast's as well. Ryan Gosling is, as mentioned, the standout performer in the film, but that's largely because he's the only character with something approaching a tangible goal and a journey toward it. We understand unrequited love, we understand the desperate want to impress, we understand the lengths, often embarrassing, that we will go to earn affection, and so we can understand, identify, and sympathize with Ken throughout the film. This is also one of Margot Robbie's better performances, though she benefits immensely for being a real-life Barbie doll. The quality that makes her just a little bit too perfect for any other role works incredibly well in this one, and it allows her to show more emotional range than most other roles she's ever had. She's very often cast in a way that's supposed to emphasize her desirability. She's the beauty object the male audience wants to attain and the female audience wants to emulate, or else banned from advertisements for the heinous crime of being too attractive and healthy. Barbie cleverly subverts this norm because it begins with attained perfection and then brings Barbie down from it. Not in looks, which the film will always struggle to accommodate, but in ideal. Because she is perfect, except for subtle and growing doubts and uncertainties that emerge over time, Robbie's looks are just kind of taken for granted, and her character, her emotions, and her expressive range become the focus instead. We're not quite there yet, but she does have some of the film's most poignant moments, and Robbie portrays them with a kind of subtlety we're not really that used to seeing from her. She's a producer on the film as well. She reportedly had a good amount of involvement in the creative process, and she went above and beyond to convince both Mattel and Warner Brothers to back the project. Too far, in some instances. If this film does end up matching Jurassic Park, then the asteroid targeted the wrong fucking species. But she clearly resonates with the character and the journey she's going to go on, and with what passes for the story in the film. And it would be nice to think that she might then be cast in a few more roles where she's not just exaggerated for perfection's sake. For all that praise though, this beach scene is an example of the film's non-existent world-building mechanics. As mentioned, the underlying idea is that these dolls are being played with by kids in the real world. And yet, because the theme demands we critique the restrictions of prescribed roles, that goes out of the window when the film has a point to make. There's nothing about the solid mechanic we began with which should prevent Beach Ken from surfing if the child playing with him wants him to. Here, the film wants to convey that labeling Ken Beach Ken denies him agency and freedom, which is why he bounces off the water and has no skills beyond beach, which isn't a skill to begin with. Sorry, Ken. The film requires that you not treat it like a film all that much, or indeed at all. There's little point even critiquing the mechanics it introduces, because they're all painfully subservient to the theme, so they'll be discarded for convenience and at a moment's notice. Oh, and Michael Cera is in this film. That's it. Totally irrelevant. He has like 3 scenes. Probably won't be mentioned again. That night, the Barbies are having a house party, and STB asks Beach Ken to stop by. Most of the noteworthy things here are really just superficial. If you're a guy, you probably think the sparkly dance routine drags on and becomes boring and slightly cringy after about 2 seconds. If you're a girl, you probably enjoyed it rather more, which is another of the film's ironies. One of its frequently repeated messages is that labels are bad, prescriptions are wrong, restrictive stereotypes are indeed restrictive, so we shouldn't draw a hard delineation between guys' films and girls' films, guys' interests and girls' interests. And yet, like its marketing campaign, the film is very, very savvy when it comes to identifying and indulging its target demographic, a demographic it has targeted on the basis of sex and sex-based interest. The song choice here is catchy and meaningless like most girls' songs. The dance routine is, well, I mean, fuck knows. I've experienced pretty much every level of drunk. I have never danced. My school made economics elective and dance compulsory, which is one of the many reasons my attendance dropped to about 60% by the end. The dance routine is a dance routine. How's that for analysis? We've also got smatterings and splatterings of both body positivity Barbie, apparently not discontinued by Mattel even though the pregnant one was, and trans Barbie, who of course cannot be trans in the Barbie world because none of these creatures has genitals.
I'd like to see what kind of nude blob he's packing under those jeans.
You do have to wonder how much of the film was designed with a keen eye on the internet, a large chunk of which reliably went into a tiz over trans Barbie, prompting the other half to go into a fizz about their reaction, ensuring that a sizable chunk of social media ended up jizzing all over it. Outrage economics is a thing. This film has generated plenty of outrage. Everyone's talking about Barbie. Story-wise, Beach Ken continues to try and impress STB, and he once again falls back into the noise and the movement of the scenery. The film does a pretty good job conveying his desperate battles with anonymity. In the overt ways, he's upstaged by Simu Liu and then lost on the dance routine, and the slightly subtler ones, as the entire scene is yanked away from him, not to mention everybody else, when STB suddenly blurts out,
"Do you guys ever think about dying?"
This brings the dance and the music to a hard stop. It accomplishes its primary effect, headlining STB, and its secondary effect, anonymizing Beach Ken. The film has remembered its primary mechanic in this instance, the link between Barbie world and the real world, and it will shortly use this to embark upon its fetch quest to the real world. STB recovers her composure, and the dance recommences, but once again it allows Margot Robbie to demonstrate her true abilities. It must be pretty hard to convey subtle emotional doubt while also engaging in high-intensity dance nonsense, but she does it pretty damn well. Outside, in the transition between dance party and slumber party, Beach Ken goes to kiss STB, but she doesn't reciprocate. He asks to stay over because they're girlfriend and boyfriend. STB asks him what they would do.
To do what?
I'm actually not sure.
And fuck me, yeah, praise again. That's not too bad. I have to get it out of the way now because, and I'm sorry to burst that big pink bubble, we're about to leave what is by far the film's strongest period and begin our decline into theme. Yes, random extended references to Citizens United actually occur in the film's most theme-light segment. Most of the humor is contained here too. This line, for example, is pretty good. It's one of those things the film has going for it, or does for the moment, that mark it out from the Hollywood meta. Its meta humor is often actually quite witty, and sometimes it's even fairly clever. Combine that with the strong performances of the cast, and those will remain throughout what follows, which is probably the only mercy we'll get, and the genuinely creative sets and the visuals, and Greta Gerwig's technical abilities, her innovative approach to her craft, and there really are quite a few things to praise about the film, especially by comparison with its peers. Even the thematic shenanigans that they doom the film later also evidence something quite refreshing: difference. The film's failure to land any of its more risky elements or follow its more daring thoughts through to something like a conclusion doesn't detract from the fact that the intent to do something a bit new is there. Not only is it there, but it was greenlit both by a major brand and a major film studio. It doesn't counterbalance the film's abject failure to turn intent into true meaning or excuse its careless and often spiteful politics, but Barbie isn't entirely comparable to the generic shallow girl boss feminism that's infected so many established franchises. Being wrong in new and sometimes interesting ways is one step up from being wrong in old and tedious and predictably boring ways. It's one step up a ladder with tens of thousands of rungs above it, of course, but it is a step up. And once again, in those rare moments it's not being destroyed by its incoherent themes, the technical aspects of the film are a cut above much modern cinema. The reversion to practical effects in particular is to be welcomed. One of the reasons I find the film so frustrating is that I suspect Greta Gerwig probably would be a really interesting person, if only she could just, sort her head out a bit. She might still be profoundly wrong, but she would at least be engagingly wrong, and engagingly wrong people are some of my favorites. STB sends Beach Ken on his way, and in the process, furthers his status as most interesting character, because once again, he has recognizable, identifiable, and completable wants and wishes. He's in pain, but the cause of that pain is proximate. The film is shortly to be much more interested in STB's own type of pain and the source thereof, which is much more abstract and bizarre and esoteric and, tellingly, indefinable, but we will come to that later. STB goes to bed, and the film then overplays its hand a little bit. You'll recall that she had to save face when she admitted her thoughts of death by continuing on with the sentence, "I'm dying to dance some more," and then the dance continued. We saw the lie from her facial expressions, we knew she was covering things up, and that was a nice and subtle way of showing. But the film isn't confident that that was quite clear enough. So as she lies down in bed, she bids the other Barbies good night and shouts out, she's definitely not thinking about death anymore. Then she looks angsty again. That's what you might call a hat on a hat. It's essentially just repeating an earlier beat in a much more overt way, and, moreover, one that actually counters the subtlety already achieved, since as far as the other Barbies know, she was never thinking about death. Having her lie down in bed looking equal parts confused and worried and dreadful would have continued the good work of the earlier scene, but having her essentially remind the audience what she's feeling and doing it verbally, that's just not as good. And the film has already precluded the "but it's for kids" defense by arguing against Citizens United. Yep, still can't believe that's in a Barbie film. Night turns to day, and we get a deliberate, shot-for-shot repeat of the previous morning, because Barbie World is supposed to be eternal and unchangingly perfect. Except that this time, things are going slightly wrong for STB. She's groggy. The song, though it's a note-for-note match of its previous iteration, has lyrics now mentioning irrepressible thoughts of death. The imaginary shower is too cold, the toast is burned, the non-existent breakfast milk is out of date, and when STB goes to fly from the roof, she falls. And when she gets to the beach and takes off her shoes, her feet, which normally remain in the high-heel position, a meta joke if you like, fall flat. None of this is excellent, but it is all serviceable stuff. There is something profoundly wrong. And because we know that Barbies are played with by people in the real world, well, sometimes, for now. Anyway, we know that the wrongness isn't here, but rather it's there. There is some sickness in the Barbie world cosmos that's really located in our dimension. The other Barbies and Kens see STB's flat feet, and they start screaming and retching. Somewhere in the crowd, Tarantino came. The Barbies tell her she's malfunctioning, and so she has to go visit Weird Barbie. Body Positivity Barbie informs us that Weird Barbie used to be the most beautiful in the world, but eventually a little girl played with her too hard, which is fine. But if we're going to be stubborn and insist on treating this as a movie and not a treatise, it does recapitulate the very patchy mechanics and actually illustrates a missed opportunity. Why is there only one Weird Barbie? There should be tens of millions of absolutely horrific Barbies. The Barbie World graveyard could be a huge landfill, a mass grave of deformed Barbies tortured and mutilated by psychopathic little girls. Barbies should have their own Holocaust mythology, for fuck's sake. Any of you have sisters? Did they ever play with Barbies? If so, you know what I'm talking about. Girls do terrifying things with Barbies. My friend and I were once rummaging through drawers looking for a GameCube controller, and we once came across two weird little rectangles of tightly wrapped tissue paper that turned out to be mummified Barbies. Barbies get their hair pulled out, their limbs pulled off, their faces drawn on with permanent marker, they get torched and stabbed and thrown around. My sister's Barbie was stabbed with the laser sword of a Gundam. By me. You could have a lot of fun with this mechanic. And this film does sometimes like to think of itself as a comedy, but it's just not that interested in that part of itself. Again, everything is subservient to theme, meaning some very clear opportunities for comedy, and for the film to be a good film, are missed, because the director has a lot to get off her chest, and that is much more important. Weird Barbie, we find out, is always in the splits, and her lot in life is to perfect other Barbies while falling further into disrepair herself. She has a toy dog that poos everywhere, STB goes to see her, and she makes sex jokes about Beach Can. She calls him a protein pop, she says she'd like to see what kind of nude blob he's packing under his jeans, and I found that fairly entertaining. But I am not a child. This is probably too overt to qualify for a Pokemon standard double entendre. It's just a sex joke, plain and simple, which is fine. But once again, my god, the trailers for this film. It'll be interesting to see how many mothers took their kids on the first weekend. Coterminously, it will be interesting to see how many mothers took their kids to see it a second time. Actually, probably quite a few of them did. That's just the kind of world we live in. Yeah, never mind. More mechanical mindfucks ensue. Because, you'll recall, it's already been established that girls in the real world play with Barbies, and so Barbie World is really determined by their imaginations. That, after all, is the reason Weird Barbie is Weird Barbie. Someone played with her too hard. But this scene proceeds as though we hadn't just been told that minutes ago. Weird Barbie tries to pretend she hasn't just undermined the entire mechanical setup by explaining that usually there's a divide between real-world girls and Barbies, no direct connection. Never the twain shall meet. Except that we know that's not true because Weird Barbie exists, film. You literally fucking explained it to us in the setup for this scene. Never mind. It's just a Barbie film. Don't criticize the Barbie film. Just accept it. A Matrix reference follows as Weird Barbie presents STB with a choice between a high heel and a sandal. And once again, if the film was interested in being, a film, there is so much potential in that. Imagine a deliberate play on The Matrix, a film that's really interested in exploiting the differences and the link between the dream world and the real world. That could have been really quite good. Barbie, though, is dispatched by the others with excited promises of adulation from the real-world women who have been saved and made powerful by the Barbies. They'll hug her and they'll champion her. She'll be endlessly thanked for the good work the Barbies have done. So off she goes, singing along to Indigo Girl's Closer to Fine, which is actually highly relevant. First, because it's a link with Barbie's real-world playmate, and second, because this song actually represents the film's elusive moral message. The lyrics, "We go to the doctor, we go to the mountains, and we look to the children, and we drink from the fountain. Yeah, we go to the Bible, and we go through the workout, and we read up on revival, and we stand up for the lookout. There's more than one answer to these questions, pointing me in a crooked line, and the less I seek my source for some definitive, the closer I am to fine." That's it. That is the entire theme of the film. You can stop watching now. If you want to find out what this is really all about, just go and listen to Closer to Fine. It's a really good song, and that's basically the entire message. Well, one half of the message of the film, the half that doesn't think that men are shit and the patriarchy is evil. Everything else is commentary and feminism. But if you're going to stick with me, yeah, strap yourself in. Ken pops up in the backseat of her car, surprising her. He's coming along for the ride. STB is reluctant to bring him, but he insists. He begs her not to make him look in front of Simu Liu's Ken, and when STB says that Simu Liu Ken isn't cool, Ken replies, "He is to me," which is a half-truth. Each Ken has by far the most relatable set of drives and motives in the film. He wants recognition generally, and STB's affections specifically. The film means to draw a dramatic contrast between Beach Ken and STB. Beach Ken's sense of self is defined by other people, which the film thinks is bad and demeaning, while STB is on a quest to find herself within herself, and this is good. Because, the less I seek my source for some definitive, the closer I am to fine. Yeah, actually, I really do like that song. But the film will bend completely out of shape to represent that resolution, and when we get there, we find it resolves, well, kind of nothing at all, really, because just be yourself is so shallow and content-free that you wouldn't even find it on a fucking bumper sticker. Anyway, the travel sequence to the real world displays more of the film's endearing visual creativity. There's a car ride, a boat ride, which is a gaudy version of a scene you might expect in The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. There's a rocket ship ride, a tandem bike ride, a camper van ride, a snowmobile ride, all done with that Wes Anderson-style static middle, revolving lo-fi scenery. I'm a big fan. This film's Barbie world is very well done. I think Greta Gerwig has worked with Wes Anderson before, the inspiration is quite clear to see. And then finally, they roll the blade into California, and this is where the film begins to go so terribly wrong. Let's be honest, you don't go to California if you want things to go right, do you? Incidentally, Greta Gerwig has talked about filming the rollerblade through California beaches scene, about how passers-by would go up to Ryan Gosling dressed in his lurid pink and yellow rollerblades and compliment him, joke around with him, while by comparison, Margot Robbie got stares from a distance. That experience actually informed the scene in the film, because Gerwig and Robbie cast this difference as leering, as objectification, as people being matey with Gosling, and almost rapaciously desirous of Margot Robbie. To quote Gerwig herself, "When we were actually shooting on Venice Beach with Margot and Ryan in neon rollerblading outfits, it was fascinating, because it was actually happening in front of us. People would go by Ryan, high-five him and say, 'Awesome, Ryan, you look great,' and they wouldn't actually say anything to Margot. They'd just look at her. It was just surreal. In that moment, she did feel self-conscious, and as the director, I wanted to protect her, but I also knew that the scene we were shooting had to be the scene where she felt exposed. And she was exposed, both as a celebrity and as a lady. To be fair, Ryan was like, 'I wish I wasn't wearing this vest,' laughs, but it was a different kind of discomfort. Here again, we get the carrying in of certain feminist assumptions, even as Gerwig will make a semi-sincere effort to transcend that label later. I think Sitch and Adam made this point as well, but let's just for the moment imagine the reaction had a bunch of guys gone up to Margot Robbie and high-fived her and complimented her looks and her outfit. Do you really mean to tell me that that wouldn't have been cited just as easily as evidence of sexism and objectification? People were happy doing that with Ryan Gosling because there's no risk attached to complimenting a guy in that way. Me Too, though, did a huge amount to preclude equitable behavior in this respect, because there is always a very real risk that equivalent interactions with famous attractive women could be misinterpreted, deliberately or otherwise, and weaponized. I would feel pretty bad for Margot Robbie in the moment Gerwig describes, but I describe an entirely different motive to it. It's not evidence of barely repressed sexual objectification, it's evidence of fear. People weren't holding themselves back from their nastier urges, they were maintaining a safe distance. None of which is to say, the former wasn't a huge problem before Me Too. We know for a fact that it was, especially in Hollywood. But the problem with such vitriolic and broad brush reactionary movements, and Me Too was absolutely a reactionary movement, is that it provides a huge disincentive to normal, innocent interactions between men and women. You don't drop nuclear bombs on specific targets. Nuclear bombs are indiscriminate and massive, and you live with terrible consequences for a very long time. You might still think that on balance Me Too was worth it, but you shouldn't attempt to gaslight people about the social problems that emerged as a result. Unless you think that this is me reading far too much into an innocuous comment by Gerwig. No, it's the premise for the entire scene. Ken's introduction to the world is joyous and wonderful, you see. People really like him, while Barbie's is her first experience of fear. She feels, she tells us as much, uncomfortable. People ogle her. A surfer bro says, "Give us a smile, blondie." She says she feels ill at ease and self-conscious. Ken says he feels admired. He says, and I quote, "There's no undertone of violence," to which STB replies, and again I quote, "Mine very much has an undertone of violence." You should just fucking hold up there, film. The year is 2023. You are on a beach in California. It is the middle of the day. This is not some seedy back alley outside a club at midnight in 1974. Neither Ken nor Barbie has any frame of reference for undertones of violence anyway, and the source of those undertones simply isn't believable. It's a fairly significant problem as well, since the film is predicated upon a divide between Barbie world and what it itself refers to as the real world. Yet almost nothing about its depictions of the real world actually matches reality. It matches, in its own way, the weightless hyper-reality of Barbie world. There is no clear distinction between the two domains except the color palette. Had the film decided to set itself back in time, things might have been a little bit different. You could justly claim that the film was satirizing the backward social attitudes of the relatively recent past had you put it back in 1979, for example. As it is, though, and to the extent the film is being genuine here, it forces you to question how in touch with reality the writers are. It likewise reveals something more about the film's true target demographic, since these behaviors and references to old-timey overt sexism probably do match the life experiences of the film's decidedly middle-aged creators. One of the theme's consistent aspects is this sense of anxiety about the world mothers send their girls into. Barbie as the surrogate for daughterhood, the narrative conveying motherly fears. Here again, then, is a set of feminist assumptions. But like all ideological ists and phobics and all the rest of those, they are incredibly outdated pastiches. Marxists predicate their political philosophy on a set of social and economic beliefs that have, respectively, changed and been proven entirely wrong decades, if not centuries ago. But the function of ideology is to preserve beliefs in time. They provide an anchor, or, to mix the metaphors, a snapshot of the world that is explicable, allowing us to make sense of new things by reference to what we think we've got worked out. They are prejudices, they are not ideas. And one of the principal reasons we find it so very hard understanding each other's worldviews is because they're particular and they are resistant to change, and they tend to discard contradicting evidence rather than accommodating it. Here is Gerwig showing both her upbringing and her age. In Barbie, California in 2023 refers back to a snapshot of the moment her prejudices were formed. It'll resonate with people of a similar age and background, people who share those experiences, people who share the outdated feminist worldview, and it might win a few converts among idiot young people who haven't formed their own snapshots yet, or whose snapshots are too boring because they don't contain the kind of existential conflict that we all secretly desire. But to anyone who doesn't share that combination of history, age, and experience and delusion, which is to say anyone more familiar with the world as it actually is, it comes across as so heavy-handed that you can't but assume that it's just naked propaganda. It so obviously doesn't accord with the world today that the natural response is either a disbelieving laugh or, if you're short-tempered and pissed off, anger at an obviously unjust attack on something that doesn't exist. The feminist director attacking a caricature of men as douchey, women-oppressing sex pests. It's the first major example of many major examples in the film going forward, and the general approach, using these cartoonishly exaggerated and outdated symbols and signs of sexual tyranny, makes the film almost entirely ineffective as satire, if satire it really wants to be. Even in this depiction, it's not completely consistent. When they go to a construction site expecting it to be full of empowered women with great feminine energy just like the building sites in Barbie Land, they find the usual loutish, fat, stereotypical builder blokes who throw out all the sex jokes and innuendos. But when STB informs them that neither she nor each can have genitals, they all just shrug and one of them says, that's okay, and that's it. Which is odd, since you'd expect that to have caused more offensive jokes, not shut them up. You can read a number of potential motives into that, but by far the simplest is that this film is PG-13, and so they just couldn't think of an appropriate jokey response. When I first saw it, I wondered whether this might be an early sign that the film would use an exaggerated caricature of patriarchy to then subvert it, dispense a few myths about the patriarchy. For example, builders being very nice and accepting of people without genitals as a sign of surprising tolerance, no? But since that sort of thing just doesn't occur again, no, I'm sticking to the PG-13 explanation. The film will do a little bit of subversion here and there, but on the whole, its idea of patriarchy isn't far removed from the overt sexism of the previous scene. The builders do give Barbie a first inkling that things in this world aren't what she'd expected them to be, that it's not the utopian matriarchy the Barbies thought they'd ushered in. Ken observes that everything seems rather to be reversed, but before we can get much further than that, some random bloke comes up and smacks STB on the arse because sexism, am I right? So they go to prison, then they get out, then they steal some clothes, then they get arrested again, and the police are also incredibly sexist. They get released again, and we're done for the moment with the overt sexism thing. The theme thinks that's pretty well established. Now we are back on mission. STB needs to find the sad little girl who's playing with her. She stops at a bus stop and sends Ken off by himself because that is really just what the film demands happen. Ken, though, is having an excellent time. He sees all these powerful men, all of them full of confidence and self-worth, going to the gym, working high-powered jobs, riding horses and such, and the play on Thus Spoke Zarathustra in the background tells us that this is his 2001-style moment of awakening. It is, assuming Gerwig is familiar enough with 2001, the essence of man on display. patriarchy. Patriarchy is the essence of man. That is what the film wants to convey. This is a man's world, and Ken has simply awoken to the fact. Barbie, meanwhile, is still at the bus stop trying to channel her playmate. This is just something she can do now, again because the film just demands it happen, because no other way of pointing STB in any particular direction exists. Like Carl Jung, she is faced with an insoluble problem, so she dreams the solution, and we are supposed to take her seriously. The dream points her to a sour-looking loner-type girl. On a purely technical level, the film is again quite competent throughout all of this. The hard juxtaposition between Ken's euphoric self-discovery and STB's empathetic reaching out to a troubled girl is a very deliberate choice, and it's quite an effective one. And I know I sound like a broken record, everything is subordinate to theme. Ken's awakening is proof that the world is full of boundless possibilities for men, while girls have it harder. They are isolated, they're dissatisfied, they're forced to be complex creatures because the world isn't really made for them. Their existence is more fraught with doubt and anxiety. The film will later tell us explicitly that anxiety is a burden unique to women in this world. And here then is the film's emotional core. Ken wants power and possessions, and they are ubiquitous for menfolk in the real world. STB wants emotional attachment. She wants to help a poor, unfortunate soul. It's a problem with any work of art that's inseparable from its politics. This dramatic idea is actually very good, it's very well conveyed. But because the idea is an innately political one, and moreover innately sex-political one, it can't but divide the audience. You can work hard to appreciate it on a purely technical level because there is much to praise there, but ultimately a brilliant poem advocating for gulags is still advocating for gulags. STB's dream sequence shows us the young girl growing up, growing apart from everyone, and in particular, a mother whose face as yet we do not see. That's a deliberate choice, because this is all a bit of a misdirect. We're shortly to learn that STB's troubled playmate is the mother, not the daughter. And if you're anything like me, you instantly start to think, hey, but is this really how the mechanics of this world work? I thought they were meant to be connected to their actual playmate. Is the film just ditching another mechanic because the story and inevitably the theme demands it be so? And the answer in this instance is no, actually. Or at least, with a bit of charity, you can make these things fit together. Because, as mentioned, the film is obsessed with mothers' anxieties. STB's dream reading in this scene does actually make sense, even by the established mechanic, if you accept that what she's doing is tapping into her playmate's dreams, not manifesting her life history. She's not seeing her playmate, she's seeing through her eyes, which is a rare instance of the theme actually aiding the art, because that's a really nice little device. The film never makes this explicit, it is quite possible it just forgot to do that, because as has been established already, it very rarely trades in subtlety. But I'm pretty sure that this is the deliberate idea behind the scene, so props to Greta Gerwig and co for that, it's a nice idea. Likewise for the panning out that closes the sequence, which actually focuses as much on men as it does on women and young girls. We see a fair few men laughing, which is supposed to accord with Ken's experiences, men enjoying the patriarchy, but then we also see a few of them alone and obviously suffering. STB's germinal realization being that this world is complicated. Human beings are complicated, and they are not entirely reducible to Barbie world dichotomies of excess. Except, of course, where the theme demands that they are. Like, the patriarchy isn't operative except where the patriarchy is. The patriarchy doesn't define men except insofar as it does. Yeah, we'll come on to that later. But the scene itself, no, that's pretty good. The dream sequence makes STB cry. It's her first experience of tears. And she's comforted by an old woman sitting next to her at the bus stop. This scene, by the way, is very well performed, but it also reveals quite a big meta problem, which I think goes some way toward explaining the contradictions in the film's depictions of men. We have the beastly sexist caricatures and the surprisingly sympathetic and heartfelt glimpses of men in pain and anguish. And these two things don't sit easily together because the film isn't very good at connecting its thoughts together. The scene with the old woman illustrates this point, or rather, Greta Gerwig illustrates it for us. They have a quick chat, and a tearful STB tells the old lady that she's beautiful. And it's a really touching scene. It's very well performed. Margot Robbie is capable of much more subtlety than I'd hitherto given her credit for. But here is what Greta Gerwig had to say about the scene. I love that scene so much. And the older woman on the bench is the costume designer Anne Ruth. She's a legend. It's a cul-de-sac of a moment in a way. It doesn't lead anywhere. And in early cuts looking at the movie, it was suggested, well, you could cut it. And actually, the story would move on just the same. And I said, if I cut the scene, I don't know what this movie's about. That's how I saw it. To me, this is the heart of the movie. The way Margot plays that moment is so gentle, so unforced. There's the more outrageous elements in the movie that other people say, oh my god, I can't believe Mattel let you do this, or I can't believe Warner Brothers let you do this. To me, the part that I can't believe is still in the movie is this little cul-de-sac that doesn't lead anywhere except for it's the heart of the movie. The heart of the movie doesn't go anywhere. Yeah, that's an issue, not a strength, because it explains why so much of the film is so disjointed. You don't have to be didactic about it, you don't have to refer back to the heart in every scene, but the heart of the movie is ideally the thing you pay off at the end of the film. It's the thing that undergirds your entire story. It's the actual thematic link between characters and motifs. If the heart of the movie is a cul-de-sac that occurs within the first half hour, it really struggles to inform, by definition because it's a cul-de-sac, anything around it, which is what allows for various other facets of the film to proceed either with no heart or with a very different and more sinister one. I think Greta Gerwig slightly undersold herself here, only slightly, but slightly nonetheless, because the scene isn't a strict cul-de-sac. Its heart does beat occasionally at various points later. There are really two sides to the film that struggle to inhabit the same coin. On the one hand, you have Barbie as social commentary, feminist spiel, political manifesto. That half of the film produces vile caricatures of men and laughably parodic depictions of patriarchal power and subjugated women. The other half of the film is intended as a character journey of self-discovery, a throwing off of chains, and in this mode, the film thinks of itself as egalitarian, not factional. Quoting Greta Gerwig again, I think of the film as humanist above anything else. How Barbie operates in Barbieland is she's entirely continuous with her environment. Even the houses have no walls because you never need to hide because there's nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed of. And suddenly finding yourself in the real world and wishing you could hide, that's the essence of being human. She was pressed on the point by the journalist interviewing her, who, doing a stunning journalism, was reluctant to accept the suggestion that the film was humanist rather than a fabulous, entirely feminist manifesto, and Gerwig elaborated. She said, "This movie is also dealing with the idea that any kind of hierarchical power structure that moves in any direction isn't so great. You go to Mattel and it's really like, oh, Barbie's been president since 1991. Barbie's gone to the moon before women could get credit cards. We kind of extrapolated out from that Barbieland is this reversed world where Barbies rule and Kens are an underclass. The reverse structure of whatever Barbieland is almost like Planet of the Apes. You can see how unfair this is for the Kens because it's totally unsustainable. In the moments when the film does convey the above, it's harking back to the beating heart of the bus stop scene. There is no patriarchy or matriarchy, there are humans. The film's clumsy attempt to mesh its two halves together takes the form of STB wanting to be simply human, wanting to find herself, wanting to experience the emotional variety and complexity on display at the bus stop. The glue isn't strong though, the two halves spend very little time stuck together. As I'll explain later, find yourself is a well-intentioned but almost entirely meaningless moral message to impart, which is one of the reasons so many critics have spent so much more time angrily railing against the overtly feminist half of the film, because those are the parts the film feels much more confident and stable on. You can essentially reduce it to an angry street preacher railing angrily and definitely about various injustices, and then, when pressed on their desired alternative, saying, well, you know, we should just, be happy or something. Yeah, okay, chum, but you don't seem very clear on that bit. I mean, before, 2 seconds ago, you seemed pretty sure the gay libs are going to burn in hell, so which bits do you want me to take seriously? The very serious threat, or the thing you can't articulate? Ken returns at this moment, and he is ecstatic, because he's learned that men rule the world. So yeah, you see what I mean? But he still loves STB, so off they go to the school because he wants to help her on her adventure. Meanwhile, a pointless interlude. Over at the Mattel offices, they've learned that Ken and STB have gotten loose. This is apparently terrible and serious. We know this because the Mattel people all say that it is, but if you want to know why that is, tough shit, we never find out. World building is for dweebs and, men. It does serve one very important purpose, which is character introduction. And by the way, can we just appreciate the irony for a second? The stereotypical woman is highly interpersonal. She cares about feelings more than facts. She likes personal stories. She likes love and romance. She is much more concerned with the inner life than the outer one. Her frames of reference are personal, not depersonal. She wants self-discovery, not world domination. Home is something you make. It isn't a castle with strategic significance. She never got into Lord of the Rings because there was just too much geography and pointless minutiae and maps and races and good and evil. I emphasize that this is a stereotype, but stereotype accuracy is one of the more replicable effects in social psychology. This describes my mother, for example, and I'm not intending all of that as a smear. Character is incredibly important, personal stories are the most compelling. Men do sometimes need to be reminded what all the fighting is actually for. V.A.V. stereotypical man. Stereotypical man wants order and rationality, imposed, if needs be, by dominance and by force. He likes war and conflict and grand epic adventures. He likes good versus evil, and heroes conquering the darkness. Feelings are relevant probably, but not at the expense of pace and action. Stereotypical man stories are not entirely depersonalized, but the personal is very much outwardly and world-oriented. He tears up at the charge of the Rohirrim. He recognizes the tactical and symbolic impact of the orcs taking Osgiliath. Home isn't something you make, that's what women do, it's something you defend. I don't give a shit what color you paint the living room, honey. Both those colors are pink. I'm busy reforging Anduril, Flame of the West. The difference is imbued in Barbie. Whenever it's not obsessing over theme, it is entirely interested in character, as in this scene. I look at it and ask, wait, what happened the last time dolls broke out of Barbie World? Why is that bad? What happened to the world? What would happen if it weren't stopped? How does this work? Well, Gerwig, yeah, I know she wrote it with Noah Baumbach, but feminist marriage rituals involve castration. No, Gerwig says, I don't know, that's not important. We need to introduce the mother and her feelings, which is what happens here. We aren't strictly speaking supposed to know it's the mother yet, but we do because the film is very rarely subtle. The Mattel employee who's discovered the breach goes to report it to the board and is stopped by what I assume is the board's secretary sitting at the door, a woman sketching various Barbies in stages of angst and emotional distress. So if you have eyes, you already know who this person is, and it won't come as a surprise later. This is STB's troubled playmate, not the daughter. She tries to stop the employee, but he walks past her and opens the door, and we meet Will Ferrell. Will Ferrell is in this film. He's the chairman of the board, and he plays himself, and his character is almost entirely irrelevant, except for thematic reasons. And even then, it's really just an afterthought. I think he has about 2 notable lines. All the board members in this world are men, because that is again what the theme demands. But the real-life Mattel board is basically a 50-50 split down sex lines is unhelpful to a film that wants to make the patriarchy as comedically overdone as possible. Subtlety be damned. Because this isn't satire, it's parody. But it's parody that thinks it's satire. Satire has a point. Satire uses humor to expose truth and flaw, while parody simply mimics things for comedic effect. Barbie thinks it's satire because it believes it has useful things to say about the patriarchy. It is in fact parody because all it's doing is aping a preconceived definition of patriarchy, one that's so exaggerated that it has no explanatory force. The film is arguing with smoke. If it were satire, it would be intensely dishonest satire, because nothing about the world it is satirizing actually exists. Men in 2023 are not as depicted in this film, they do not run the world, they don't openly harass women en masse on California beaches, they are not 100% of the Mattel board, the patriarchy does not really exist. And I'm doing the film a kindness by denying it the label of satire, it's parody. Parody with delusions of grandeur. For a precious few minutes, the Mattel board poses something of a threat to Ken and STB. They want to put them in the box that will send them back to Barbie World. This never happens. The board is pretty much entirely irrelevant going forward, save for those 2 moments when the theme has a use for them, onto which we shall shortly come. STB and Beach Ken meanwhile arrive at a high school. STB describes her anxiety. Ken counters that he feels amazing, and a passing whale woman snootily tells him, that's because kids don't take it out on the dads. Yeah, sure film, sure. Maybe they'd be more likely to take it out on the dads if the mums weren't such bitches. Or if the dads actually won more custody battles. Or if more women chose to work full-time to support the household. Or if more dads actually stuck around after knocking a woman up. Or if women kicked fewer men out of the house. Or if there weren't a perfectly natural and ingrained difference in the way children respond to men and women in positions of authority. Or if we stopped ignoring the many ways in which children do take it out on their fathers. But no, see, because this is again part of the political theme, and so there is precious little room for fact. It's vitally important that we get the message across instead. It's another one of those tacit feminist assumptions the film drags in as baggage, and not coincidentally, it's one of the assumptions that paints women in a pretty negative light. Everyone has these problems, yet from the way this film and its ideological inspirations talk, you'd think only women suffer as a result. Female empowerment claims so often rest on the presumption that women are the passive receivers of terrible injustice who need to be freed of their chains by ideologues. They're not active participants with a vast amount of agency, they're an underclass to whom things happen. Man the fuck up, ladies. STB goes looking for the miserable girl, while Ken goes to the library looking for books about trucks. STB finds the miserable girl, whose name is Sasha, but when she introduces herself, Sasha slaps her down brutally. In the first place, she thinks she's crazy to believe she's really Barbie. She further says that it was horrible having to play with Barbies as a child because, and here I quote her, "You've been making women feel bad about themselves since you were invented. You represent everything that's wrong with our culture. Sexualized capitalism, unrealistic physical ideals. Look at yourself. You set the feminist movement back 50 years. You destroyed girls' innate sense of worth, and you're killing the planet with your glorification of rampant consumerism. I am powerful, and until you showed up, I hadn't thought about you in years, you fascist." And yeah, I think this is the section that more than any other has given rise to the "but it's really satirizing leftism" argument. Because yes, it is obviously absurd. It's a string of buzzwords, received opinions, fashionable hashtag thoughts. It's obviously nonsense, isn't it? Surely we're not meant to take it seriously. Surely we're supposed to treat this all as satire, right? Well, no. Because here is what Greta Gerwig said of the scene. But with that scene in particular, my awareness of Barbie as a thing in the world completely corresponded with me knowing the arguments against Barbie. I didn't think there was any way to do this without giving that real estate and having well-articulated, correct arguments from a really smart character given to Barbie against Barbie. I also grew up with a mum who was kind of against Barbie, so that's how I knew all that. If you don't give a voice to that, then you are nowheresville. I say again, well-articulated, correct arguments from a really smart character. That doesn't sound like satire to me, chaps. Gerwig believes that this is a sincere attack on Barbie and what she represents. It's annoying, by the way, that we have to refer to Gerwig on the point, but a function of highly political art is that it requires a rebirth of the author. It's a flaw with the film if you can't understand its intent without reference to external interviews, but it's an extension of politics that authorial intent not only matters, but is essential to understanding what we see on and hear from our screens. If this scene seems like a satire of leftism and feminist critiques of society, that is not because it was intended to be so. As is so often the case, sincere belief is so prima facie absurd that it presents as self-satirizing. But that doesn't mean satire was the deliberate effect. It's unintentionally perfect. It accidentally shows the absurdity of true belief. The only qualifier is that though Gerwig believes this insufferable child is incredibly intelligent and has presented well-articulated and correct arguments against Barbie, she nevertheless is slightly uncomfortable with them. Gerwig seems to agree with the intellectual take, but she's going to go on to attempt to lift the film above questions of fact and onto questions of character and emotional truth. Sasha isn't wrong in her ideological takedown of consumerism and beauty standards and all the rest, but she is in some way limited by it. The crux of the film is self-becoming, and that entails moving above and beyond systems of thought and ideology. Sasha will never be proven wrong. She'll never change the content of her beliefs because Greta Gerwig acknowledges that those are well-articulated and correct. But in time, she'll develop a set of non-intellectual values that add an extra dimension to her character and to her relationships, especially with her mother. This really combines the film's greatest strength and its greatest weakness, because Gerwig attempts to cling on to all her baggage while also trying to transcend it. It's a bit to both have and eat your cake. The strength is in the film's attempts to transcend categories of thought and belief, which is something Gerwig has tried before, notably in Lady Bird, which is similarly a story about motherhood's complicated relationship with daughterhood and an attempt to show how love survives a conflict of visions. Like Barbie, Lady Bird heavily features a high school girl whose relationship with her mother is strained. Like Barbie, the girl believes another perfect world awaits her outside the confines of the home, only to realize that things aren't quite as simple as all of that. Like Barbie, the girl's experimentation with the new world leaves her emotionally compromised, but her mother is likewise distraught at her own short-sighted strictness. And like Barbie, Lady Bird closes with an awkward but romantic realization that the truth, though never truly definable, is not strictly reducible to ideology. It lives somewhere between contesting ideals. Self-discovery is essential. You can't be defined by others' wishes. Parents shouldn't demand too much of their children, but children shouldn't expect too much of their parents. Motherhood is a tricky business. Only by letting go of each other can we come closer together. That is Barbie's strength, not least because Gerwig is covering familiar ground. The weakness is everything else, all the ideological baggage strewn everywhere, because self-discovery and ideology fundamentally conflict with each other. You cannot simultaneously recite Feminism 101 and champion individual self-discovery. The first precludes the second. Gerwig sits awkwardly between the positions of mother and daughter in Lady Bird and Barbie and humanity in this film. Telling people what's right and wrong cannot sit easily in a film that ultimately wants us to believe we must discover these things for ourselves. So, once again, the film isn't satirizing feminism, nor is it, though, a strict feminist screed. It's both, and neither, and it's something else entirely, all at the same time, making for something that is sometimes emotional and endearing, sometimes it's even interesting, but for the most part, it's incoherent. Anyway, Sasha makes STB cry and she runs away. Ken, meanwhile, picks out a bunch of books about the patriarchy from the school library and goes off to try and get various high-status, high-paying jobs. The first of this succession of scenes is probably one of the hardest in the film to read. He asks for one such job and is told he can't have it because he lacks qualifications. He doesn't have a PhD, for example. He says, "Isn't being a man enough?" And the business suit replies, "Actually, at the moment, it's kind of the opposite." Ken observes, "You're clearly not doing patriarchy very well." And the business suit says, "No, we are, we're just hiding it better." Now you might ask, what's this supposed to be? Is this the film tacitly acknowledging that its parody patriarchy isn't all it's cracked up to be? Is this a sneaky bit of satire? The film undermining unsophisticated feminist pastiches of patriarchy? It's genuinely not easy to say because you can read it two ways, and they are both equally plausible at first glance. Either A, this is the film trying to show that the patriarchy isn't this all-consuming, all-powerful force, and men really aren't as powerful as they are portrayed as being, or B, it is all of these things, but as a result, it is failing men. Because A would be genuinely clever subversion, not to mention it would be right, the answer of course is in fact B. We've touched on Barbie's quest for self-discovery, but Ken's emerges over the course of what follows as a shedding of assumptions. He also needs to find himself, and that requires doing away with the ideals foisted on him by the patriarchy. The patriarchy has to exist, and it has to exist as the film depicts it, for Ken to have a journey. Ken being constantly rebuffed when trying to use manhood to secure jobs in the real world isn't a critique of the feminist conception of patriarchy, it's a recapitulation of it, albeit in a less vindictive form than we're used to seeing. It's a well, actually moment. The actually being that the patriarchy really harms men, don't you see? By measuring their worth against their status and their possessions, while making it so very hard to truly attain and retain these things. Don't get me wrong, that's better than being screamed at by an obese pink-haired fanatic, to be sure, but it comes from the same place. It erects the same straw man of the patriarchy. It critiques the patriarchy on a similar basis. Ken returns to STB, but she's accosted by Mattel's Secret Service and taken away, so he decides to return to Barbieland in order to tell the Kens all he's learned, and start the patriarchy afresh, where there will be no need for qualifications. Sasha, meanwhile, is picked up by her mother, and they spot STB being put in the unmarked truck. Sasha's mother, of course, knows that this is really Barbie, so they follow the agents. STB is taken before the Mattel board, and they offer to put her inside the box that will send her back to Barbieland. She asks to see the woman in charge, but learns that there is no woman in charge, because this is a patriarchy, and all the board are men, even though neither of those things is true. One board member says, "I'm a man with no power, does that make me a woman?" Fucking slow clap for that one, very good film. Well done. Will Ferrell attempts to pretend that Mattel really loves women, because they've hired 2 of them throughout history, which is again untrue. The entire real-world plot thread is punching at fucking ghosts. It's not just reductio ad absurdum, it's reductio ad complete bullshit. And it's a shame because in other ways the film is subtle, just once or twice, occasionally it has depth, but it sacrifices all of it for the most part in the name of one half of its self-contradicting theme. It could have been so much better than this. Add another item to the eternal list of things ruined by feminism, I guess. STB gets in the box, but then she gets out of it again and asks to go to the bathroom to make sure her hair is perfect. And because this film's real-world segment is just as wild and wacky and unreal as its Barbieland segment, the board of course say, "Okay, sure," which affords her an opportunity to escape, inevitably. Which is the kind of dumb decision I would spend a lot of time on where there's actively trying to, well, be a film. But since it isn't, it's just kind of par for the course. Anything goes, everything goes if theme demands it, and so obviously they let her wander off. The escape serves 3 functions. In the first place, it gives us a chase scene best described as light farce. It's not really a chase scene. All the pursuers just run about the office in strange patterns without really trying to catch her, making it resemble one of those famous Scooby-Doo haunted house chases, which would be fine if it were, just kind of funny, but it isn't. In the second place, it allows the film to do a weird in service of, well, it's not really even in service of the theme, though it probably thinks that it is. The film uses 2 Matrix references here, unending hallway with unending doors, and kind old woman who serves as mysterious oracle-type figure. In this instance, the oracle is Ruth Handler, the creator of Barbie. STB stumbles through one of the doors and finds Ruth sitting in an old-timey kitchen offering her sanctuary. She's characterized in a way not dissimilar to the oracle in The Matrix, old and kindly offering tea, speaking in vague and mysterious ways. STB greets her revelation with, "So a woman does work here," which is a surprise to this film but not to anyone familiar with the real world. Handler says, "We do more than just work here," which is again a surprise to this film but not to anyone familiar with the real world, not least because everyone knows Handler invented Barbie. It's not some hushed-up secret. Anyway, she'll come back again right at the end of the film, but with an equivalently slight role in the plot. For now, they hear the Mattel execs closing in, so Handler directs STB outside, where she's picked up by Sasha and her mother, who rescue her. The film has precisely 1.5 ideas for Sasha and her mother, and it has very little time in which to convey them. Or rather, it has more time than it thinks it has to convey them, and so it takes the odd decision of wrapping everything up really by the end of the second act, which leaves these two characters mostly redundant for the finale. Idea number 1. It's not Sasha who's been upset and playing with Barbie, leading to the rift in the continuum that brought STB here, it's her mother. Her mother has been sad and miserable and lonely recently, hence STB's problems. So it's the mother who needs to be satisfied. Idea number 0.5. Her sadness is brought about by distance from her daughter, who must come closer to her mother again in order that the world be fixed. And pretty much all of this comes about in the space of a single car journey. Excellent. See why I mentioned Lady Bird earlier? This is essentially that. It's just condensed and compressed, and then compressed again, and then put in a zip folder for good measure, which is then emailed to a friend who doesn't have WinRAR. STB and Mother, I genuinely don't remember Mother's name, come to the same realization at the same time. Mother has been drawing irrepressible thoughts of death Barbie. STB discovers this. They now know that they are responsible for each other, which cues a look of surprise and concern and obviously disdainful realization from Sasha, and then another memory flashback to Mother and Sasha playing with Barbies together until Sasha moves out and becomes a surly asshole who scorns her mother's affections. Sasha moans about the ridiculousness of this plot point, which is the only point on which we will agree, and Mother replies, "I'm just a boring mum with a boring job and a daughter who hates me. Can you blame me for wanting to have a little fun?" And I have to point out, no, you dozy mare, that is not what you were doing, is it? That's never even been suggested. Even the film doesn't think that's what you were doing. STB is here because you were miserable, not because you wanted to have fun, but as is well established, everything in this film is subordinate to theme, and that includes dialogue, so who the fuck cares? A high-octane car chase is probably not the best place to put one of the film's most important emotional beats, so they decide the best thing to do is to resolve it in Barbieland, leaving Sasha's father behind because he'll just be fine. On the way back to Barbieland, Barbie makes sure that the less attentive audience members remember the premise. Barbieland is the perfect matriarchy. Women have all the jobs, they have all the power, etc. The montage also allows us to fast-track Sasha's character development because in hearing how amazing the matriarchy is, she becomes much less surly and much more interested, establishing commonality with her mother in the space of about 15 seconds. The Mattel execs, of course, aren't far behind them. They are going to follow them because, as Will Ferrell explains, humans in Barbieland could lead to strange and terrible things in the real world. One of the execs asks the burning question, like what? And Ferrell sums up this film's attitude to everything not called theme by replying, nothing any of our collective imaginations could possibly dream of. Okay, sure. And to top it off, a joke then that fails to land so hard that it fractures its own ribs, as one of the execs replies, like a podcast hosted by 2 wise trees? Or 2,000 young fathers? Anyway, in Barbieland, they drive past the beach. They see that everything seems to be wrong, because everyone is happy. The Kens are happy, they're active, playing sports and such, and the Barbies are happy, lounging around, tanning themselves, and bringing beers to the Kens and chatting and having a good, lazy, fun time. We even hear President Barbie say, "This is so much funner than being president." But wherever there is fun, there must be a feminist to ruin it with angry lectures about oppressive patriarchal systems. That is this film's meta, so from here on out, the film dedicates itself to ensuring that the fun must stop. We cannot have people enjoying themselves. Relations between men and women aren't supposed to be enjoyable. Women who'd prefer to be in love than sit on the Supreme Court are just fucking wrong. It turns out that Ken has turned STB's dream house into his man pad, or as he calls it, his Mojo Dojo Casa house. He's taught the Kens all about patriarchy, all about self-respect, all about accomplishment and achievement, and his, to the film's mind, completely incorrect notions of self-worth. Peculiarly, we then cut away to the rollerblading Mattel execs, who are told that already these Mojo Dojo Casa houses are flying off the shelves, and there's a Ken movie in production. So given how long Ken's been back in Barbieland, you have to wonder A, how, and B, how they're only just hearing about this. But to ask these questions would be to assume that the movie gives a shit, and we already know that it doesn't. The other weird bit is that this alarms Will Ferrell, who balks at the suggestion he should accept it just because the new toys are making the company money. He says they have values, you see, which more or less guarantees he will say the precise opposite when faced with the same problem later. STB attempts to solicit support from the other Barbies and is shocked and disappointed to learn that they're all really happy in their new lives. Lest you be in any doubt of the fact I mentioned way back at the top that nobody hates women quite like other women, the film outright compares these newly liberated Barbies to smallpox victims, as Mother explains that the patriarchy is akin to smallpox wiping out the Native Americans who had no resistance to it. Happiness, you see, ladies, happiness is a disease. Self-discovery is also very important, only if you do it right. What's that? You're wondering what happened to the subplot between Sasha and her mother? Well, never mind, this is more important. Ken explains that STB failed him, that the real world showed him what it was like to be valued and respected. And now he's brought this knowledge back and transformed Barbieland into Kendom. The Kens have taken over. The Kens now do all the work. They're the Prime Minister and the President and the Supreme Court bench. They're the Nobel Prize winners. And they are shortly to change the Constitution to ensure that all this remains the same way forever. Why haven't they done that already? Well, because the film needs a nominal ticking clock in the background to keep up the pretense that it still has a plot. That's basically the only reason. STB moans that the Barbies worked hard and dreamed hard to make Barbieland a reality, which they didn't, because we know they didn't. And she's supposed to know they didn't, because the whole point of the real world sequence, and the whole reason Sasha and Mother are here, is that these Barbies are played with. Girls in the real world built this, not the Barbies themselves. Oh, but then you might be asking, does that mean boys in the real world are playing with the Kens? The answer is no, because in this moment we're proceeding as though the mechanic not only isn't operative, it simply never existed. Hey-ho. I love good film writing. As mentioned 1,000 million times already, everything is subordinate to theme, and theme is principally conveyed by character to the exclusion of almost everything else. The subsequent scene, as Ken first lauds his success over STB, but then comes in close and makes it personal, is a strong one. It's well performed. Gosling and Robbie are consistently excellent throughout, but it's also quite well realized, at least in this one particular aspect. Ken asks STB how it feels. Not fun, is it, he says, and indeed it is not. This is Gerwig ramping up toward the admittedly botched realization that strict systems of any stripe and flavor are inevitably dehumanizing and so unsustainable, and so the scene does represent something like an attack on certain strands of feminist thought. The Kens suffered under total matriarchy. The fault in this particular idea, of course, is that the parallel is being drawn with a non-existent system. The intent is to show how matriarchy would oppress men just as patriarchy does oppress women, which doesn't work unless you buy into the film's depiction of the patriarchy. As mentioned, it is so comically overdone that it's innately unbelievable, and the result is therefore nothing like as clever as the film seems to think it is. Gerwig is parodying a type of feminism that is inverting a patriarchy that in the most charitable interpretation hasn't existed for generations, or in a less charitable interpretation never really existed at all. So to anyone not already wed to that particular misconception, the moral point has all the force of someone standing up boldly and saying, hey, have you ever thought that, maybe Nazism and communism are both bad? The sane person thinks, well, yes, no shit, darling. Don't get me wrong, it is preferable to a Nazi standing up and decrying communism in service of Nazism, or vice versa. It's arguing against inversion, not, or at least not yet, advocating for it. As so often, the film ties itself in knots on this point a little bit later. It's enough to give the feel of moral and intellectual depth, to give the impression the film has something unusual to say, but not quite enough to make that all a reality. It's yet another example of the film being much more comfortable on the offense, saying, this is what I'm against, than on the defense, saying, this is what I stand for. Character does slightly redeem theme in this scene though, because we see already, that all this is in effect Ken compensating for what he still doesn't have, true love and affection. Gerwig's critique of masculinity, which is emphasized much more strongly in the remaining portion of the film, is that it so often is compensatory. Possessions and social status are things men crave, but they either don't know or won't acknowledge what their true interests are. They are, in Gerwig's formulation, symbols of absence, not of success. This is part of what makes the patriarchy, to use her own word again, unsustainable. And this contestable idea is well conveyed by Robbie and Gosling. Ken is bitter at STB for all his successes. There's a semblance of vengeance in his motive. He's simultaneously trying to punish her and prove himself to her. That tension bubbles under the surface and reinforces Ken as really the standout character in the film for the reasons previously stated. He has a tangible goal toward which he's working and a realizable set of conditions for failure and success. Ken wants the girl. By contrast, STB's journey has seemed to lack direction since she met up with Mother. For about 3 minutes it morphed into, and my job is to make her feel happy. But the film isn't really interested in doing that, not least because already somewhere in the back of its mind is the moral message toward which it's building. Nobody else can make you happy, you have to find that within yourself. Unfortunately, that means STB lacks anything like an overarching sense of purpose. Her purpose is in fact to have no purpose. But that does give us very little to invest in, for all Robbie's doing her best to convey feelings of threat and sadness and anger and resentment at her new condition. It's not really going anywhere on a personal level, and on a meta level, it's going somewhere that's really not as pleasant as the film will try to convey it as being, because her mission is shortly to morph into, hey, you see all those happy Barbies supporting their happy Kens? How about we ruin that? At some point in the intervening, which I haven't mentioned because it's not actually on the screen, we have effectively had the resolution of mother and daughter's arc, by the way. It's kind of just done. She and Sasha are now firmly on each other's side. We'll get, I think, one line to confirm it later, when Sasha says that her mum is actually pretty cool and talented, but that's really just another hat on a hat. The resolution has been conveyed already, that's just a little extra bit because the script evidently felt it hadn't done them justice. Yes, hooray for throat sweets. The script was right to feel that way. It's one of the most bafflingly wastes of strong story potential you're likely to see on the screen. But that's because, to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat the fact again, everything is subservient to theme, and their role in the plot now is to further the theme. STB says she used to be perfect, she never wanted anything to change, and Mother replies, honey, that's life. Sasha nods in agreement. STB has to learn what being alive really is. Being alive means uncertainty and doubt, the full range of human emotions. STB doesn't need to know that, she needs to be set on the path to discovering that for herself and to discover the value in it. A better film might have had STB learn this by exploring the same dynamic between Sasha and Mother, with Sasha as STB's surrogate. This would be to retread ground Gerwig has already covered, not least in Lady Bird, but A, there's value in repeating the lesson for a mainstream audience, and B, this film is already retreading that ground anyway. It's just doing it incompetently. Better a competent rehash than an incompetent one in my book. STB tells Sasha and Mother to go back to their own messed up world and leave her to hers. She says it's the lowest she's ever been emotionally, so we get to cut away to a spoof advert for depressed Barbie, and on the cam copy you will hear one person laugh. Actually, it's not really much of a laugh, it's kind of a and it's a male voice. The iron rule of Barbie is that any man who laughs more than twice during this film wants to get laid, and I think that was a fuck me laugh, because the spoof is just, well, it's there, and that's kind of it really, it's nothing special. STB is woken up by Weird Barbie and taken away by her band of what we'll call the Rebel Barbies. The Mattel execs are still skating toward Barbieland. Sasha and Mother are driving away from it. They start singing Closer to Fine Again. I actually really like that song. It probably deserved to be the moral symbol of a better film than this. And yes, this is confirmation that mother and daughter have overcome that previously existential divide. Strong idea, risible execution. For some reason, there's a bunch of builders working on the road ahead of them, but Michael Cera, because he's in the film again, he starts beating them up, which allows Mother and Sasha to escape them. I genuinely don't have a clue what that scene was meant to be about. Sasha, though, is the one who says that they have to turn around, go back, and save Barbie in Barbieland. This is the scene where she tells her mum how amazing she really is. I've not actually counted, but I'm sure that entire arc took under 15 minutes, and most of that was about other things anyway. Back in Barbieland, the Rebel Barbies are trying, and I use their own words, to deprogram a captured happy Barbie. They have been, and I quote again, brainwashed. False consciousness, guys. Happiness is just false consciousness. STB complains that she's not pretty anymore, and then Helen Mirren pops up. Note to the filmmakers, she says, Margot Robbie is the wrong person to cast if you want to make this point. This is at the same time funny and true, and bad. It's funny because you genuinely don't expect it. Mirren hasn't said a word for, what, an hour? And it's such a short interruption. It's just, yeah, it's a bit random, but it has the shock value, it makes it quite entertaining, and it also happens to be true. Internet nerds who say that Margot Robbie is mid are just absurd. My friend, if you have a beard that goes all the way from your neck to your scrotum via a stomach half the size of Mount Olympus, if you look like the gamer guy from Make Love Not Warcraft, you have absolutely no business calling any humanoid woman mid. And Margot Robbie simply is not mid. If anything, she's disconcertingly perfect. She is the perfect person to cast as a Barbie doll because she is a walking Barbie doll. There's something slightly odd and depersonalized about her. She's the type of person you expect to see on magazine covers and never really consider to be real. None of that's intended as a slight. I have no idea who she is underneath. Maybe she's lovely, maybe she's not. But she is, if anything, a bit too perfect. And that brings us on to bad, because the film has attempted to sidle away from quite an important point, using meta-humor as a shield. Helen Mirren is right. Margot Robbie is the wrong person to cast to make this point. But that itself suggests that Margot Robbie, solely by virtue of her looks, is in an immensely privileged position. She's largely immune to the problems that real women face. I've complimented her acting range in this film already, but there is no way someone who looks like that doesn't make it in the media in some capacity. Her life and much of her career exist because of qualities that she did not choose. Pretty women are at an immense advantage, not only compared to other less pretty women, but compared to men as a whole. Most men are, to quote Christopher Hitchens, catastrophically ugly. Very few men, comparatively, can trade on looks alone to advance their professional prospects. Hitch's theory for why women aren't funny is that they have no evolutionary need to be, while men have to compensate for the misfortunes of their birth by working on their skills and their personalities. If the world is a patriarchy, then Margot Robbie exists because of it. She has immense privilege because of it. A great many of the Barbies shown in this film, with the unavoidably large exception of body positivity Barbie, exist because of it. And if the world isn't a patriarchy, they still exist in large part because of their advantage over men, not because they are oppressed by them. Societies generally seldom skew toward one sex at the exclusion of the other. They tend to skew in both directions at once, but in different ways, affording unique advantages and disadvantages to each. The film is trying to pretend here that STB is worthless now that she's not pretty, so she must find some worth within herself, which is almost an admirable intention, I'd say, but it has to meta-joke its way out of the obvious fact that it is not true. The film wants it to be true, because we must now embark upon one of the longest, most self-pitying and self-aggrandizing and nakedly political speeches you are ever likely to see on a film. Apparently this took 2 days and 50 takes and it left everybody in tears. I don't think that's because it's a complicated scene or even emotionally impactful. I think it's because it's just so fucking long. Honestly, this is what happens when you let women complain without interruption. It just never fucking ends. STB's doubts are the lead-in. Essentially, the film taking a deep breath before a seemingly interminable stream of shit pours out of its mouth hole. STB says that she's not smart enough to be interesting, she's never done brain surgery, she's never flown a plane, even though she rode a car and a boat and a space rocket earlier, but never the fuck mind. She's not the president, nobody on the Supreme Court is her, which is the film trying to show how hard it is for women under the patriarchy, because they are told to aspire and yet they have no role models. This is a world in which Kamala Harris, by the way, is second in line to the American throne by virtue of her race and her sex. The only qualifying factor that's not an innate characteristic is her ability to spot the right dick to blow in Chicago, allegedly. This is also a world in which we were told Hillary Clinton should be president because A, it was her turn, and B, it was a woman's turn, time for a woman. It's a world in which, asked by Anderson Cooper what would distinguish her from a third term of Barack Obama, she could spread her arms and say, "I think it's pretty obvious what the difference is," and get applauded for that. This is a world in which Elon Musk can form a task force dedicated to exploring the future of AI and so the future of mankind, and the response from the tech department of Bloomberg was, there aren't enough women on this panel. It's a world in which countless think pieces about the excellence of women CEOs exist. It's a world in which Stephen King will periodically tweet that a world run by women would be less violent despite the evidence of history. It's a world in which Marvel will bend all of its films out of shape and sense in order to prove that women can handle everything, they don't need no man. It's a world in which people will happily argue for closing the gender pay gap by ensuring that women earn more than men for the same amount of work. It's a world in which women represent more than 50% of the American voter base and could have everything they wanted if they all banded together, but no. No. The problem is that women just have it so tough because they can't look up and see themselves represented in positions of power. To go to another Greta Gerwig film, Little Women, the world is hard on ambitious girls. That film was set in the 1800s, and here Barbie attempts to argue that nothing has changed. I've said it once, I will say it again. Man the fuck up. Hearing STB's entirely unjustified self-doubts, mother snaps. I shall relay her complaints with the forbearance of a put-upon husband who gets home after a 10-hour workday to be told by his stay-at-home wife that he's just not good enough for her. She says, and I quote, "It is literally impossible to be a woman. You are so beautiful, so smart, and it kills me that you don't think you're good enough. Like, we always have to be extraordinary, but somehow we're always doing it wrong. You have to be thin, but not too thin, and you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but also you have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time. You have to be a career woman, but also always looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty you tempt them too much, or that you threaten other women because you're supposed to be part of the sisterhood, but always stand out and always be grateful. But never forget that the system is rigged, so find a way to acknowledge that, but also always be grateful. You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show your fear, never get out of line. It's too hard, it's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. Then it turns out that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault. I'm just so tired of watching myself and every single other woman tie herself into knots so that people will like us. And if all of that is also true for a doll just representing a woman, then I don't even know. Fuck me, Amadeus. Okay, are you ready? Let's begin. In the first place, no, it's not literally impossible to be a woman. You're being one right now with your endless contradictory self-pitying rants, and people can become a woman by signing a fucking form in some countries. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to details like the difference between literally and figuratively, you would have a better job, my dear. In the second place, everyone wants to be extraordinary. Most people do it wrong. It has nothing to do with being a woman, it's called being human. A large part of becoming an adult is learning to find happiness and fulfillment in the little things that you have, because not everyone can be the fucking president. But you know what makes it more likely that you will be extraordinary? Putting the goddamn work in. Just down the road, the Kens have created a whole-ass patriarchy because they wanted it, and so they worked for it, and so they achieved it. Men generally do not complain that they are not allowed to be exceptional. They try to be, they work hard at it, and if they get angry, it's usually because they failed and someone is objectively better than them. To want to be passively treated as exceptional, as head of the harem, putting no work in, disproves point 1. You are literally being a woman, my dear. Point 3. Yes, you absolutely should want to be thin if you yourself are equating thin with healthy. You should want to be healthy. The complaint that people will criticize you for trying to be thin is a complaint about other women, because I guarantee you it's not men who campaign to ban adverts of bikini-clad models on the London Underground. It's unhappy fat women who don't want to put in the work. Men don't have this problem. Men who look at buff superheroes and want to emulate them go to the gym. If you want to be ideal, you put in the work. Put down the cake, darling. No, you do not need that second bottle of red wine. One should be enough to get you through an episode of Bridgerton. Oh, and while we're at it, how about you stop watching Bridgerton and go to the gym, then wind down by reading a fucking book? Because, hey, men learned quite a long time ago that personality is quite important. Point 4. I have no idea where the money point came from. There are plenty of ways to make money, and plenty of men who'll happily earn it on your behalf. Literally just down the road, my dear, the Kens are doing all the work while the Barbies are happy lounging around on the beach. Fetching the odd beer in exchange for total financial support isn't the bad deal this film seems to think it is. You have agency in the world, lady. In Japan, it's traditional for the housewife to control all the money the husband brings in. I don't like sounding like an undergraduate lefty, but it sounds to me like you're inventing white woman problems here. Female streamers make money by sitting in hot tubs and flashing their tit canyon. I guarantee you they make more money than I do, and I work harder. And the film has already shown us that you work the job while your husband sits at home learning Spanish on Duolingo. You're in charge. How about you act like it? Point 5, you have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. That is everyone these days. And the people most likely to complain about workplace bullying at the slightest provocation, the people least able to handle the rough and tumble workplace, the people most likely to work in the HR departments adjudicating workplace abuse, they are all fucking women. You think it's hard being a female boss? That's probably because you employ women. Men don't tend to give a shit about this stuff. Men are not likely to sue you for unfair dismissal because you pointed out they're spending too much time listening to Taylor Swift and taking period days. This has nothing to do with being a woman, it has quite a lot to do with employing them, and I guess employing men who might as well be women because all the estrogen in the tap water has sapped the self-respect out of them. Stop it. Point 6, because she just keeps fucking going. It's perfectly possible to love your baby and not be boring. Men manage this all the time. When my 30-something sociology teacher at school got pregnant, we spent a whole hour-long lesson looking at her fucking baby pictures. And yes, it was still probably more useful than learning sociology. When my male science teacher had a baby, I didn't find out about it until I saw him pick it up from the nursery 2 years later. The only thing about this complaint that has anything to do with you being a woman is that you overshare with people in inappropriate settings. That makes this a you problem, my dear. You had a baby. Good for you. Now tell me what Durkheim wrote about suicide, because if you show me one more goddamn picture of this generic infant, I think I'll take him up on it. Point 7. You don't have to be a career woman. The only people who insist that you be one of those are other women. And maybe the occasional male CEO might encourage it from time to time because, lo and behold, doubling the workforce keeps the wages down. Be a housewife if that's what you want to do. Be a career woman if that's what you want to do. Don't choose of your own volition to take a completely optional path in life and then moan about it like it makes it impossible to be a woman. What are you talking about? And just go away with this juxtaposition between being a career woman and being caring. It's perfectly possible to be both. If you find it hard to be both, how about you have some sympathy for the men who went for centuries supporting a household on one income, who'd really have loved to have spent more time at home with the kid, but couldn't because they were supporting you. Once again, the only thing this has to do with being a woman is the fact that you are standing here now, bitching about it like it's some terrible existential burden unique to women. No, women are not exceptional. Point 8. You do not have to be accountable for men's bad behavior. I can't think of a single example where that claim necessarily holds. You can choose to do it if you want to, or you can choose not to do it. Leslie Headland never took accountability for Harvey Weinstein's bad behavior even when she was fetching his coffees, and she's making shows for Disney. Ghislaine Maxwell isn't in prison because she held herself accountable for Epstein's bad behavior. She's in prison because she facilitated it. Stand up for yourself. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Point 9. Yep, you're absolutely right. The idea women should have to alter their behavior to avoid predatory men is deeply regrettable. But, and here's another newsflash for you, my dear, everyone does it. Everyone alters their behavior to account for context and circumstance. Men do it all the time. Worldwide, almost 80% of homicide victims are men. You are more likely to be raped than I am. I am much more likely to be beaten to death or shot or stabbed in a street. We live in a deeply imperfect world of deeply flawed and evil people. If I'm walking down a particular city street at a particular time of day, or night rather, I take my headphones out. I keep my phone hidden. I keep my eyes on my periphery. More often than not, I avoid those areas entirely at that time of night. Should I have to do that? No. Do I have to do it? Yes. You wouldn't walk down the high street in Kabul dressed like you were trying to pull a guy in a Soho nightclub if you have any sense. You are responsible for your own protection before anybody else is, and part of that entails acknowledging reality. If that means dressing down, you bloody well dress down. If that means carrying a rape alarm, you carry one. I'm on your side against anyone who'd seek to abuse you, my dear, and so is the law. But if you think the existence of crime makes it impossible to be a woman, then you might as well fly to Canada and get yourself some healthcare, because really you are finding it impossible to be a human. Props though for realizing that it's other women who'll attack you for being too pretty. That's the first thing you've said that's actually correct. Take it up with the sisterhood. I don't want to hear it. Point 10. Never forget the system is rigged, but be grateful. Rigged by what? For whom? Girls currently dominate boys in education because we switched wholesale from examination to coursework in order to lift them up, and simultaneously switched older-style liberal schooling in which men were more involved for a teaching profession in which women vastly outnumber the men. Unmarried women who spend as long in the workforce as men tend to out-earn men. For as long as I've been alive, social programs designed to re-engineer women into STEM have taken precedence over the basic educational needs and career interests of both sexes. Women are eligible for affirmative action, men generally are not. The Corporate Equality Index and broader ESG metrics focus on female employment, not male employment. The courts find in favor of women in custody battles vastly more often than they do men. According to English legal definitions, women are incapable of committing rape. The prevailing political opinion is that misogyny should A, be defined as broadly as possible, and B, be a hate crime in such jurisdictions where hate crime is a legitimate legal concept. Women, as I will never tire of pointing out, represent half or more of the voting age public in most developed nations, and their votes count equally as those of men. Women benefit from immense sex-based advantages, legally, politically, and socially. And I'm not even a fucking meninist. I've taken flack before for saying that I find men's rights activism objectionable, but if the system is rigged, I will need some convincing before I accept that it's being rigged against women rather than for them. We're not talking about Islamic societies, we're talking about left liberal progressive Western ones. Female dissatisfaction with such disparities as do exist are, almost without fail, dissatisfaction with the choices made by other women. They just blame men to avoid revealing the fact. So no, I don't think I'll accept that one either. Point 11. Never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show your fear, never get out of line. It's too hard, it's too contradictory, nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. Well, wait a minute. Weren't you just complaining about 3 clauses ago that you were expected to be exceptional? Oh, I shouldn't have to be special, but hey, why isn't anybody giving me a medal? God, everyone expects me to be pretty, but I hate that I'm not allowed to show off. Oh my goodness, I'm accused of being too mean at work, but oh, I'm not allowed to fail. Just make your fucking mind up, darling. Way to play down to the stereotype again. Objectionable women, i.e. women who are rude and show-offs and selfish, tend to be quite successful. Stop demeaning the potential of your own sex, my dear. It's like idiots who say that you can't expect black people to focus in school or show up on time or work hard because that's all white supremacy. Thanks the Smithsonian for illustrating this so well, while ignoring that the highest earners by far in Western nations are Chinese, Indian, and Japanese people who, well, what? Are they doing white supremacy better than white people do? Anglo-Saxons are mid-tier earners in the United States. There is a greater earnings disparity between black populations than between the highest earning black populations and the white people average. No, you're not owed success. The same habits and practices that make one group successful make another group successful. Women who exhibit masculine behavior types compete with and often outcompete men by relevant metrics. You can't complain that people want you to be exceptional and then complain about being exceptional, nor should you complain about disparities in certain fields like STEM and elide all mention of disparities in fields where the disparity works the other way. The only reason to complain about the disparity in STEM but not in, say, teaching, is if you, the complainer, value STEM more highly than teaching, therapy, social sciences, care, home industry, and the huge number of sectors where women predominate and outcompete men. For a film that's about to tell us that prescribing the correct path in life is prima facie wrong, you are doing an awful lot of subliminal prescription yourself here, mother. As for getting old, nobody wants to do that, and old men are not attractive qua old men. Old men remain desirable objects for younger women because they tend to have accumulated an immense amount of material wealth which young women value. The film is likewise going to complain in short order that men shouldn't be defined by such things, but in doing so, it displays the age-old problem with any idea born of feminist roots. It hates the choices made by other women. And we're not even going to mention that the disadvantages faced by older women are compensated for by the immense advantages enjoyed by younger women. Tie them down early, ladies. Men are fickle creatures. Point 12. And I think we can wrap the speech up in this one because, stereotypically, a lot of noise here is being made about nothing. It's a speech told by a woman full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. A reminder is necessary because, my God, that was a long and silly speech. She said, "Then it turns out that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault. Sigh. I'm just so tired of watching myself and every single other woman tie herself into knots so that people will like us. And if all that is also true of adults representing a woman, then I don't even know." Yeah, I don't even know. No, evidently you do not even know. Because this speech began by claiming it is literally impossible to be a woman, and all its supporting evidence was a litany of abject nonsense. The fundamental irony, as I'm sure I've mentioned already, is that a film predicated on feminist assumptions that seeks to transcend rigid definitions and predefined hierarchies is doing everything it can to conform to those things, particularly to stereotypes. It's probably the ultimate of the many important indications that Barbie's feminist assumptions undermine, to use Greta Gerwig's formulation, the film's humanist ideals. Everything we've just heard is not only so very female, but so very feminist. This is absolutely not the place to go into any lengthy discussion of sex-based psychological differences between men and women, but anyone interested in it could use Barbie as the basis for quite an interesting video on the subject. The way Barbie's socio-political concerns have so much to say about the inchoate inner life and so little regard for outward-looking impositions of order, power, class, and status. About the expectation that society should change to recognize the perfect inner truth rather than be changed by inner truth. About the way every individual problem is social rather than a hard divide between the individual and the social. About the way offenses against natural justice are evidenced by upset feelings rather than problems to be fixed by individual agency. There is no male equivalent of mother's speech in this scene for the reasons the film itself actually recognizes later and is realized already without noticing it. The Kens, being disadvantaged second-order non-persons unhappy with their lot, see the solution in individual action, in becoming dominant over the system that upset them. Their realization is that if you want change, you have to make it. You have no innate worth. Your worth is measured by your success, your personality, your knowledge, your possessions, your skills, your physical mark upon the world. Mother, on the other hand, looks at a not dissimilar set of problems and finds the fault in them because they are perceived as natural injustice. It's not that equilibrium is the state of nature, it's not that equality of opportunity is the means that determines the end, it's that inequality per se is injustice, and any problem she faces is somebody else's fault, somebody else's failure to see who she really is and what she's really worth. Stereotypical man says, I will strive to prove perfection. Stereotypical woman says, I am perfect, why does nobody recognize it? It's like looking into the reflecting glass and asking, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And expecting the only just answer, why you, my queen? You are the fairest of them all. When the answer comes back in a way you don't like, a different but related agency comes into play. Stereotypical woman doesn't think she needs to prove her innate worth because she's already perfect, but she will damn well make sure everyone sees how unworthy her competition is. This is the descent of man and selection in relation to sex. From that, read the Rebel Barbies' response to their happy but alien co-females. We don't need to prove our worth, we're already better than them, we just need to reveal how imperfect they are, the lowly harlots. And you know what the ultimate irony is? It's that Mother has just stood there giving this long, overtly political speech to a bunch of previously happy Barbies, and in response, they wake up and completely change their point of view. Yet the film has the gall to suggest that it's the happy Barbies who've been brainwashed. No, you absolute drip. If anyone's doing the brainwashing here, it's fucking Mother. It's the rebel Barbies. These are the Taliban. This is the Islamist brainwashing scene. The happy Barbies are content, fulfilled. The only way to create an order the unhappy Barbies can sit on top of is to convince the happy Barbies that they are less than they think, to make them unhappy, to ensure A, that the Kens are brought to heel, and B, that the heel on their collective dick is yours and nobody else's. That's what makes the film more interesting than generic girl boss fare, by the way, because most girl bosses are written by men for women. They have innately male characteristics. They dominate in the way we expect men to dominate. Part of the reason for the failure of any given MCU girl boss character from Phase 4 onwards is that they alienate their core audience, men, without attracting the desired alternative, women, because they fundamentally misunderstand the difference between the sexes where domination and fulfillment is concerned. Any given MCU property might be designed to appeal to women, but Barbie actually does. Not because it's really cognizant of the difference, not because it's alive to the distinction, because it's really neither of those things, but because the assumptions it brings in track the difference. It's in the blood. This is a woman written by a woman for women, rather than a woman written by a man for women. Anyway, the speech has the desired effect. The previously happy Barbies they've captured are now unhappy, and they have to concoct a plan to ruin the lives and relationships of everybody else. I do love me some feminism. We know, by the way, that they've been, deprogrammed, because one of the previously happy Barbies suddenly remembers that she once wrote a book. She says that the last few, how long has it really been? Minutes? Hours? Days? Well, however the fuck long it's been, and I quote, "It's been like a dream. It's like I was really invested in the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League." Yeah, nobody at Warner is at all bitter about that episode, right? This is one of the very few jokes at the expense of Zack Snyder and his droid army that doesn't really feel earned or justified. I am all for taking the piss out of him and his fans, I am all for doing that. But this joke feels both incredibly cliquey, incredibly niche, and incredibly random. The film hasn't shied away from niche references, and its motive for doing that is fine. I like films that make very sly references sometimes that only a very small portion of the audience will get. But this isn't really a sly reference, it's an overt one, and an implicit attack on another living filmmaker, which is one of those risks Greta Gerwig might not want to take, given how open she leaves herself to ridicule.
You know, it's something that I've thought deeply about and I care deeply about.
So yeah, all in all, well done Barbie, you've managed to make me not laugh at a joke at Zack Snyder's expense. In case the present mechanic isn't clear enough to the audience, STB then stands up and rounds off the conclusion of what can only be described as a student leftist women's studies essay. She says, and I quote, "By giving voice to the cognitive dissonance required to be a woman under the patriarchy, you robbed it of its power." Oh, they did it. They did the wake up sheeple thing. Yay. Funny how this self-same argument is either entirely valid or obviously wrong depending on the politics of the person uttering it, isn't it? Change a couple of nouns and you will find a QAnon nutter saying exactly the same thing.
Almost all the frogs don't now want females. They want to have sex with males who don't produce eggs, so that frogs are dying. And I said, it's making the frickin' frogs gay.
But there, it's a ridiculous threat to democracy, while here it deserves applause and earnest nods and maybe a few lady tears because they're just so happy it represents all the thoughts inside their head. Fuck off, Grace Randolph. They must now go and spread the message to the happy Barbies in order that they too recognize how difficult it is to be a woman, because at the moment they're all laboring under the false belief that it's actually quite nice and easy. In order to do this, they have to get the Barbies away from their Kens, and to do that, they are going to use decoy Barbies who pretend to be brainwashed. The decoy Barbie has first to appear helpless and confused because the Kens, read men, will always go out of their way to help a helpless and confused Barbie, read women. And this, according to the film, is self-evidently wrong and evil. This will lead the Kens to let their guard down, which, doesn't that mean that men open up to women in distress and become both honest and loving and helpful? I think that's kind of what it means. But yes, again, the film thinks this is self-evidently evil. Down with honesty and love. No more of that sort of thing. We get a montage of sorts as various Barbies cling onto the arms of the various Kens and listen aptly as the Kens share their knowledge with them. The Kens talk about the history of motoring, they help the Barbies understand computers and technology, the genius of and influences behind Coppola's The Godfather. They give them financial advice, they recite the history of various musical genres, they play music to them, they encourage doubtful Barbies that they really are beautiful, they help them learn sports, and so on, and so on, and so on, and you're left thinking, just hang on a minute, all of this is good. The Kens are lovely. They're helpful, they're knowledgeable, they're successful because they've worked hard to attain all of this. And by attaining it, they've persuaded the Barbies entirely of their own accord, mind you, that the Kens are worthy of love and affection. They've proven themselves. This world is pretty close to ideal. There's balance, stability, equilibrium, mutual happiness and fulfillment. And the rebel Barbies want to destroy all of this because my patriarchy's bad? Film, have you accidentally cast yourself as the villain here? What about any of this is worthy of extermination? Why do you want to revert to a matriarchy where none of it's true? Because remember, nothing about this new patriarchy precludes the Barbies choosing to continue to act for themselves, think for themselves, learn skills, have hobbies, take on interests, write books, play sports, run for office, etc. The matriarchy did that to the Kens earlier, but this new patriarchy has simply empowered the Kens to take on the role of fully formed active citizens, and it's empowered the Barbies to choose what they want for themselves. Accidentally based Barbie has constructed a brilliant argument for what it would insist on calling the patriarchy, and it doesn't even try to explain why this system deserves to be torn down. It just shows us a small group of bitter malcontents who find other women's happiness threatening, and that is all we're going to get. There will never be a motive. Once again, disproving the idea that this is all some clever satire, the film assumes that the patriarchy as described and depicted is self-evidently bad. It doesn't feel the need to justify itself because it assumes its audience agrees with its presuppositions. It isn't trying to convert, it's preaching to the converted, a stereotypically undereducated and overly politicized subset of unhappy women who want to externalize their own failures and their own unhappiness and tear down those who are above them. In universe, of course, conversion does happen. Laughably, the film still insists that what's happening here is deprogramming and unbrainwashing, but the means by which they do this to the happy Barbies looks an awful lot like programming and brainwashing. While the Kens are distracted by the fifth column Barbies, the happy and content Barbies are literally kidnapped, shoved in the back of vans, and taken back to Weird Barbie's house where they are tied to chairs and Mother recites more feminist talking points at them until they snap out of their contentedness, their delusions. You are doing the brainwashing, Mother. You are the bad guys. How do you not see this? The next step of the Barbies' evil plan is to turn the Kens against each other, causing them to fight amongst themselves, while behind their backs the Barbies sneak into the Supreme Court and reverse the planned constitutional change, because that is totally how this all works. To turn the Kens against each other, they have to make them ask, and I quote, whether they have enough power over each other. Here then is a not dissimilar problem to the male-written girl boss characters in Marvel, because this is He-Man as written by women. It fundamentally misunderstands men's motives, thought processes, and natural inclinations, just as male Marvel writers fundamentally misunderstand women's. I'd quibble with this formulation a bit, but I'll keep it the same for simplicity's sake. That is what has created the world we now see around us. That is what has created the patriarchy under which everyone is so very happy. It's not that men have never considered whether they have enough power over other Kens, it's that they are constantly trying to prove that they are more powerful than the other Kens. The gaining of skills and knowledge is healthy competition, with rules that are tacitly and mutually understood. And the reason that the Kens are not constantly at war with each other already is that they have plenty of non-violent avenues in which to engage in what is, essentially, friendly sexual selection. Because this is a girls' film written by women, and in particular by feminists, the Barbies' laughably simplistic plan is fundamentally solipsistic. They believe that they are everything to the Kens. All of this is really about the women. They believe that by simply denying a few Kens of their Barbies, the Kens will inevitably go to war. Because all society revolves around women, according to this film's mindset, according to the stereotypical female mindset, even as it also likes to claim that women have absolutely no power under the patriarchy. This should already be impossible, by the way, because there isn't a one-to-one proportionality between the number of Kens and Barbies as things stand. And yet the idea boils down to, one night at a beach, we'll all sit with the Kens, then some of us will disappear, and they will fight over those who remain to prove that they are better than each other. Except, of course, that there are already missing Barbies, because all the weird Barbies, all the rebel Barbies are here, and because, in particular, STB and Beach Ken are not together. Beach Ken built this entire new empire, and he hasn't gone to war in a power struggle with the other Kens, even though he doesn't have Barbie next to him. So no, A, your plan is cruel and spiteful, and it's destroying good things for no reason. B, it not coincidentally makes you seem much more important than you really are, ladies. And C, it doesn't even logically work. STB goes to visit Beach Ken and lie to him and trick him into believing that she's really happy in the Kendom now and that she's decided she loves him after all, so she wants to be his girlfriend. Once again, my dear, you are being fucking evil. Beach Ken hesitates but then says, yeah, okay, and he grabs his guitar, and the film then proceeds to mock him, while also making what it believes is a sly and cutting satirical point about the patriarchy, as he plays Push by Matchbox 20. The mocking is that we get a little title card over the top reading 4 hours later. The quote-unquote satire is that feminists have long argued that this song is highly sexist, not to mention abusive, because the lyrics include lines like, I want to push you around, well I will, I want to push you down, well I will. And yes, that is highly sexist, highly abusive even, which is, kind of the point actually, since at least if you take the band's word for it, the song was written from the perspective of one of the bandmates' ex-girlfriends. The woman is being abusive, not the man. Now, Gerwig has said that she doesn't put anything in her movies that she doesn't love, and so presumably she means this to be extended to the song. So let's be as charitable as we possibly can be. Is there any way the song isn't being used to characterize an abusive patriarchy? Can we maybe say that, well, Gerwig knows the true intent of the song and the lyrics, so the reason Ken sings this to Barbie is that from his perspective, she is an abusive ex-girlfriend? I think that's definitely possible. The camera pans out to show that all the Kens are singing this song to all the Barbies immediately before the switch-out plan goes into effect. That partially depersonalizes the song, but it can still be read in much the same way because all the Kens in this reading in some way view the Barbies as abusive ex-girlfriends. After all, the only reason they've built the patriarchy is because the Barbies rejected them. But it is complicated by the fact that in this moment they are not ex-girlfriends. And it's also complicated by the fact that the vast majority of the audience will not come away thinking that maybe the song is an implicit criticism of the Barbies. I'm quite sure that most people will read it as an attack on patriarchal attitudes, not a criticism of abusive women. And then of course, against that charitable read, which has it that the film is aware of the song's actual meaning, we get an overt controlling boyfriend trope. STB goes on her phone in the middle of the song and starts texting. Beach Ken gets jealous and nervous and angry and demands to know who she's talking to, and he grabs the phone from her to find she's been texting one of the other Kens. Then she leaves him and goes to flirt with that other Ken in front of him, and the rest of the Barbies do the same thing. The narrator has said that the final stage of the plan is to, and I quote, give them their dream come true, and at the peak of their happiness, when they think you actually care about this song, you take it all away. You play on their egos and their petty jealousies, and you turn them against each other. I mean, just fucking wow. You guys are absolutely evil. By the way, I've had to read into the film that the plan did involve a switch out with some Barbies secretly disappearing, leading to a gender imbalance and therefore jealousy and competition amongst the Kens. But the film doesn't actually make that explicit. And given the plan is literally being narrated in every other detail, I am wondering whether I was right to be so charitable. It could well just be a plot hole. Because unless some of the Barbies disappear, then simply playing musical chairs with the Kens isn't going to have the desired effect if the desired effect is to make the Kens compete over a decreased, insufficient number of Barbies. If all the Kens have a Barbie at the start, they will all have a Barbie at the end, and the film has already shown us that they're not that picky about which Barbie they have. That was what allowed the distraction part of the plan to work. So yes, some of the Barbies have to disappear during the beach stage of the plan, but given the film didn't make that clear, even as it was explaining the rest of the plan step by step, I am leaning more now on the interpretation that it is a plot hole, not a deliberate elision. The only alternate explanation I can think of is that again this is evidence that the female writers are imparting their own psychology onto men's character, because that type of competition is very much more female than men. Whatever the case, the plan succeeds. The Kens go to war with tennis rackets and volleyballs and such. It takes the form of a song/dance/fight number, probably the strongest original song in the film, and one that further humanizes Ken himself. It plays on what we've already discussed, his real, personal, understandable, even sympathetic self-doubts and his quest to overcome them. Which is very awkward for the film because the contrast it's unintentionally inviting is with the cold, calculating, and cruel machinations of the feminist Barbies from the previous scene. Not only are they responsible for the original pain and suffering the patriarchy sought to rectify, they are responsible for its recrudescence. The patriarchy wasn't perfect, as evidenced by Beach Ken's remaining lack of true love, but it was damn near perfect. It was much more happy than not, and the happiness was mutual. Now, thanks to a few miserable women, the world is at war. Remind me who the heroes are meant to be? Oh, and the Mattel execs show up during the Battle of the Kens? They've been rollerblading for a fucking long time, and they don't really need to be here. There's precisely one line that Will Ferrell will deliver later which requires this intrusion by the real world.
Who in the world would slow roast a dog's asshole and serve it to their husband? You would.
But the line isn't worth it, really. It barely matters at all. It's a clunky, cluttered mess. It only distracts from what the film wants to be, a climactic battle dance number. And of that number itself, it maintains the film's visual and auditory style and innovation. There's a lot to recommend it on those fronts, just as there always has been, though the Ken's beach off probably does drag on rather too long. Hitherto, the film has been gaudy but not excessive. The beach off sequence is gaudy and excessive. It loses track of its original purpose, because the Kens got into this because they're supposed to be fighting. And then the film just kind of gets bored of that halfway through, so it becomes a joint dance, and then it comes to a perfunctory end because someone pops up at Ken's ear and whispers that they were supposed to have been changing the Constitution today, so that's it. The theme reasserts itself, the fight ends, we have a more important thing to do. It was, just a bit of a damp squib in the end. While the Kens have been fighting and then dancing together, the Barbies have secretly reversed the Constitution and defeated the patriarchy. The Barbies have, and I quote, their brains and autonomy back. The Barbies have retaken the presidency and the Supreme Court, and they've taken back all the dream houses, which, if you'll recall, now means that the Kens have nowhere to live, because unlike in the patriarchy, the matriarchy excluded an entire sect from meaningful existence. Kendom is no more, Barbieland returns. I do so love it when the villains win. The Kens are upset, but they are powerless to resist, because that's just what the film demands happen. Besides them, the only person not quite satisfied with all this is STB herself. She goes to comfort a crying beach Ken. He tries to reassure himself by saying that running stuff was hard and the patriarchy wasn't really as interesting as he first thought it would be, which is something invented at this precise moment because it's what the theme demands. We are now moving away from the overt feminist part of the film and toward what Gerwig claims is its humanist heart. Do these two parts of the theme go together at all? No. Does the film care? Also, no. Ken tells STB that he always thought this would be their house. She says sorry for taking him for granted. He goes to kiss her, so she gets another chance to reject him. He says he doesn't know who he is without her. She replies, "You're Ken." Ken's rejoinder, there is no just Ken. It's supposed to be Barbie and Ken. It's why he was created. It's the reason he exists. She says it's time for him to discover who Ken really is. He tries to kiss her again, she rejects him again and says, "You have to figure out who you are without me. You're not your girlfriend, you're not your house, you're not even beach. Maybe all the things you thought made you you aren't really you. Maybe it's Barbie and it's Ken." Ken says, "Ken is me?" STB says, "Yes." All the Kens take solace and relief from the knowledge that Ken is just me with a capital M. They don't even really care about being Kens anymore. They just want to be themselves. At most, they want to be friends with the Barbies, but ultimately they've discovered self-worth, and self-worth is independence. Everyone is happy. No one needs anybody else. Until they reach the age of 40 and realize that actually me isn't really enough, is it? Me is actually largely defined by actions, achievements, and external evidence and relationships. The self actually quite wants to give self to others and help them define themselves. Maybe joint existence is really the fulfillment of humanity, but now you're 40 and you've realized it all just a few years too late. No, I'm only kidding. Of course, none of that's in the film. What is in the film is Will Ferrell, who is about to have the only line that really justifies having him here at all. He's been hiding in a shed while the fight panned out, and he now comes out and says, yes, it's so hard to be a leader. He and the Mattel execs start clowning around a bit because comedy. Thanks to the Barbies, he says he can now relieve himself of his existential burdens while holding on to his very real title of CEO. He can restore everything in Barbieland to exactly the way it was. But this suggestion is rejected. President Barbie says they don't want things to go back to exactly the way they were because nobody deserves to live in the shadows, not even the Kens. Even though that was entirely the Barbies' fault because the film has ditched the idea that all these dolls are being played with by kids in the real world, this leads one of the Kens to ask whether the Kens can have just one Supreme Court justice, and so naturally he's told of course you can, because that's the extension of theme, right? This is the humanist part of the film, and that's where it has to leave. You shouldn't have to prove your worth, remember? That's what Mother said. Equality is a right, it's not something you have to earn. Oh no, actually no, because the theme has like multiple personalities. And so despite this part of theme being principally concerned with questions of self, individual worth and consciousness, with shirking labels, overcoming differences and all that, it's also feminist. The theme is also and always will be also feminist. And feminism and humanism simply cannot be wed. So President Barbie responds, no, the Kens cannot have a single Supreme Court seat. They have to start with some irrelevant little district court and work their way up because, as Helen Mirren says, popping back into the role of narrator, the Kens have to start somewhere, and one day they might have as much power and influence as women have in the real world. So in short, you do have to earn equality, which I'm morally certain is not the message the film would want you to take away. The motive that primes it is really just vengeance. This is the feminist half of theme trying to murder the humanist part of theme. Because in the real world, women have to fight for the rights they enjoy, even though we're also told they don't really have many of those, but whatever. The Kens, who are not responsible for women's real-world travails, have to be made to fight for the same rights and status, even though Mother earlier said that it was ridiculous that women should have to be accountable for the bad behavior of other people. Essentially, the Kens are copying the blame for the women's real-world troubles, some real, most imagined, which they perceive as being caused by men. The Kens are being held accountable for men's actions. Film, have you just tried listening to yourself at all? Did you read this part of the script? Were you even listening when Mother went on her rant? Because to be honest, I wouldn't blame you if you'd switched off. I did, until I had to go and write it out again. Evidently you weren't paying attention because you've just contradicted yourself. You had Mother say that as evidence for the claim it is impossible to be a woman, that women are expected to answer for men's bad behavior. You've also just spent time telling us how it's very important that we not be defined by other people's ideas and actions, and how it's very important that we are able to be ourselves as individuals, not merely be reduced to agents of one system or another. you are about to have Barbie literally leave Barbieland in a bid to drive home this point. Why the fuck are you so inconsistent about what you want? Oh yeah, you're written by a woman, never mind. Mother, meanwhile, has more to say, because of course she does. She suggests to Will Ferrell that Mattel just makes an ordinary Barbie, a Barbie who isn't president, a Barbie who is just Barbie, a Barbie who could be a mum or not a mum, or a president but not a president, or a mum who is president, or a mum who doesn't want to be president, or a president who doesn't want to be a mum, because all of that is okay. Normal Barbie can just have a flattering top, and all she wants is to get through the day feeling good about herself, and she can choose her own aspirations for herself. Will Ferrell says it's a terrible idea, but when the other execs point out it will make lots of money, he immediately pivots to say he loves the idea. Jesus H. shite. Why is it whenever Mother speaks, the entire film just collapses into abject nonsense? The simplest one first. We had one scene earlier where Will Ferrell rejected a money-making idea because he said he wants to inspire girls' dreams. Now he's purely motivated by money. You cannot have this character think both of these things at once, film. As for the normal Barbie suggestion, how, Mother, do you expect a doll to represent these various different wants and aspirations? Could it be, perhaps, that you would have, I don't know, an identikit doll and a load of different clothing lines you could buy that will allow girls to dress the doll in a manner conveying the aspiration they've chosen for themselves? You know, something like already exists in real fucking life? You are just describing Barbie, you dozy cabbage. You already have that. Just stop talking. Your words are like a crow. Anyway, we're nearly done. We just have to wrap up STB's storyline, which you'd think we'd already closed because we've just established that Barbie represents choice now, but no, that's not quite enough for Theme. Theme demands that we absolutely know that it's okay to be unsure about things, because being unsure about things allows us to figure them out for ourselves, and that's what it is to be human. So Ruth pops back into the film. Ruth Handler, remember her? She was in one scene earlier. STB says she doesn't really feel like a Barbie anymore, even though her reason for doing that is that she doesn't think she has an ending, and Ruth explains to her that that was always the point of Barbie. Barbie never had an ending. But never mind, logic, along with everything else, is subservient to Theme. Ruth and STB go for a stroll through a blank white world, summing up the plot, saving the world from the patriarchy, bringing a mother and daughter together, one of which was just bad, and the other of which was comically underdeveloped to the point of translucence. STB says she wants to make meaning now, not be the thing that is made. She wants to do the imagining, not be the idea. She wants to be human. Ruth crams in another motherhood reference, since that's really what this part of the film is actually about. She says, "We mothers stand still so our daughters can look back and see how far they've come," which is a really nice line. It's just that it's loaded with meanings that actually conflict the theme it's trying to service. Leaving aside that mothers do not stand still, old people stand still, mothers who do eventually choose to settle have actually transcended the point that theme is trying to convey. They are not purely individual agents. Their self-discovery required other people, just like we were told it doesn't about 5 minutes ago. Mothers' lives are, by definition, interconnected and interdependent. They rely on husbands, they rely on the welfare state, they rely on grandparents, and they rely on their own parents, and their children rely on them. They buy Barbies for their daughters in the hopes their daughters will be inspired to achieve things, but the choice of career they give the daughter reflects their own biases. The film's humanist theme wants us to believe that we can just find all of these things out for ourselves, that being a mother is somehow a kind of status that can exist independently of everything else. That's what the humanist part of the theme seems to think, but the rest of the film spends a vast chunk of its runtime explaining how the individual is irrevocably impacted by systems that must self-evidently, to Gerwig at least, be torn down. In advocating self-reliance, the film firmly conveys Gerwig's own biases and preconceptions, and her moral premises, and her favorite ideology, and it propagates all of these things in the name of self-discovery. And what ultimately does being an individual woman look like in the film's mind? Well, having a vagina. That's pretty much it. Or genitals more broadly. We get a lovely montage of young girls growing up, feeling various emotions, experiencing life's many varieties, just in case you missed how important motherhood is, which you would be forgiven for doing, because though the film has concerns about motherhood, it has nothing to say for it. STB becomes human. She goes to the real world, she's taken to a clinic by Mother and Sasha, she makes an appointment to see her gynecologist, and that is the end of the film. That is a deliberate choice, I'm sure. We're meant to think it's shot in such a way as to convey the idea that she is going to apply for a job somewhere. So the gynecologist revelation subverts expectations and drives home the theme we just finished laying out. It furthers this aspect of theme. We're not showing what being a woman entails in any grander sense, We are simply showing that she is an individual person now. She has genitalia. The rest is up to her. The Barbie film tells us that we're not supposed to aspire, so the Barbie film will not tell us to aspire to any one particular thing. Now then, there are lots of words in this review, but very few of them, compared to usual videos, cover the traditional focus of videos like this: plot, character, and world building, because world building is non-existent, plot is threadbare, and characters do what they do in accordance with theme, not internal lives and thoughts. Consequently, we spend a huge amount of time talking about theme, which invariably means talking about politics, since one half of the theme, the most powerful half of the theme, the dominant half of the theme, is innately political. It's a bundle of political statements. Occasionally, the other half of theme, humanism, intrudes upon the first, which is feminism, in a way that makes mostly implicit and very, very rarely explicit criticisms of only the easiest targets in feminist movements. That scant evidence is what's led certain reviewers to suggest the film was overall a satire of feminism, but I think we've shown quite conclusively that it was nothing of the sort, certainly not in the minds of the people who actually made the film. The film, in their mind, is fundamentally feminist. All of its assumptions are feminist. Much of what passes for its plot is motivated by those assumptions, and the rare criticisms it seems to make represent an abortive desire to transcend only those extensions of feminism that the film finds boring. The film is at its strongest in those moments. It's what makes it more interesting than a straightforward manifesto. But its attempts to develop the other side of theme, the more important side, the humanist side, only reveal contradictions. The film's have-your-cake-and-eat-it approach has it that most of feminism is both right and important, but what matters most is you yourself, your own thoughts, your own journey, your own personal transcending of labels and the demands and aspirations of other people. But because the film's assumptions are rote feminism, because the world in which this story takes place is entirely feministic, it is much more concrete when it's laying out that side of the theme, leaving the other half, the humanist half it believes to be at least equivalently important, a shallow kind of nothingness. Of course it's important to have self-worth. Of course it's important to be yourself. If the film had been surely and certainly about overcoming all systems in aid of that liberal ideal, systems including feminism, it would have been much stronger and even praiseworthy. But it's not about that. It doesn't object to feminism. It's about transcending systems the film doesn't like and furthering the assumptions of those it does. And because it has a very wishy-washy conception of what self-fulfillment entails, well, it inevitably sacrifices itself to the political half of theme. It likewise undermines itself with its constant invocations of the anxiety surrounding motherhood. The lessons it would have young women take are very different from the implications for raising children. The film attempts to reconcile the two by having Barbie stand as surrogate for both young woman and young child, mother and daughter, representing in different ways the mother's anxieties, the daughter's struggles to break free of those anxieties. But this is a muddle. These two ideas have to be clear and distinct in order that the humanist part of the theme be any way intelligible. Combining them in the figure of Barbie simply contributes to the sense that this side of theme, the humanist side, is really an absence more than it is an idea, an absence into which the film's political theme gladly streams. Self-fulfillment in young adulthood is important. Self-fulfillment that informs your status as mother is important. Self-fulfillment as a desire for a young child is nonsensical. Here then is the problem with the Be Yourself mantra the film has belatedly taken as its own. It means nothing for the most important part of its audience. When Mother argues that Mattel should just create a normal Barbie, she is reacting against feminism just as much as the patriarchy and the matriarchy and all the other evil hierarchies and divisions that Greta Gerwig believes hold us back. She's arguing against feminism as much as those other things because the creation of these innumerable professional aspirational Barbies was originally motivated by the same line we hear trotted out in defense of forced diversity in media. If we don't give little girls something to aspire to beyond motherhood, how can we possibly expect them to aspire to anything beyond motherhood? And in their own way, the feminists were right about that. Children are impressionable. It is impossible to bring a child up in perfect isolation. Children are incapable of simply being themselves. Babies display gendered behavior from as early as around 9 months, which is long before they are shown to have a psychological awareness of gender and gender difference, i.e. girls act as girls before they know what girls are, and that they are distinct from boys, and so on. You can overstate the difference, you can draw too firm a distinction, but the anecdotal does not defeat the general point. Nor does it particularly matter whether you attribute basic differences in behavior between the sexes to nature or to nurture, the overall point stands. The vast majority of nurtured characteristics are not conscious impositions. They reflect a myriad of nurture differences encompassing the lifespan of parents, grandparents, teachers, and peer groups. It's next to impossible to create a perfectly controlled environment to test the impact of nurture, because those doing the nurturing were themselves not brought up in controlled environments. You don't have much more control over your social environment than you do your in utero environment. Children are incredibly malleable and susceptible to influence, and yet there are so many influences on them that the result of them is impossible to completely predict. Children have to be socialized to become part of society, to become human. No child can decide for itself what its interests are, who it likes, who it hates, what its tastes and aspirations may be. Self-fulfillment as a message for a child is impossible in that sense, but no one other person determines them for the child. Arguments about education are often the bitterest and most emotionally and politically charged, precisely because it entails a battle over the direction of childhood. Whether you're a Nazi or a Soviet communist, or a wacko Boko Haram devotee, or a Baptist, or a Tory, or a Christian nationalist, or a Reagan Republican, everyone is always battling over who gets de facto custody of youth. There is no such thing as simply letting kids be kids. This can have terrible effects, and it can have good ones, and what you consider terrible and good largely depends which of the aforementioned groups you belong to. I'd argue the original feminist demand for more aspirational Barbie types probably did rather more good than harm, given it allows for aspirational lessons while leaving it to the procurer, the parent, to direct their consumer, the child, down what they believe to be a morally worthy and fulfilling path. Mother's nonsensical demand for a normal Barbie in this film misses the point, not only because it already exists, but because it doesn't know who it's supposed to benefit from that. Is it talking about children or young women in this situation? Gerwig herself seems vaguely uncomfortable with the idea of parental direction to court. This, again, is what's made Barbie's true message so hard to pin down. Gerwig's critique of the professional Barbie types is essentially that these still amount to restrictions on the individual. You see, she says to older feminists, you claim you want freedom and liberty and equality, but you're still prescribing desirable outcomes. You are still dictating what the next generation should aspire to. And where's the freedom there? In allowing the Barbies to re-establish a matriarchy, albeit a more egalitarian matriarchy, but then having STB leave Barbie world in pursuit of true humanity, she is sort of leveling an attack against social systems per se, but one that can only be applied to womanhood, not to childhood. Gerwig's old assumptions are all still there. Lip service feminism that pretends that the Mattel board directing girls' aspirations is composed entirely of men. Lip service feminism repeating decades-old lampoons of a patriarchy that died decades ago if it ever existed. Lip service feminism that denies Ken's a Supreme Court seat in order to parallel women's long march to freedom in the real world. But it is just lip service feminism. Feminist assumptions populating a theme that strains to escape its own labels. There is no satire of feminism in this movie. There's just an approach to feminism that occasionally, very occasionally, rises to the level of the heterodox. In her ideal world for women, not for children, about whom she has little to say, Gerwig's feminism, like the Marxian state, withers away. Truly liberated women have no need of it. Breaking away from Barbie world is breaking away from an old ideal. Don't be a woman with a capital W as defined by other people, just be a woman. In fact, we can do a little experiment. Here's an excerpt from Marx with the word religion switched for feminism. Let's see how well it tracks the thematic resolution of Barbie. The foundation of Gerwig's criticism is, woman makes feminism, feminism does not make woman. Feminism is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of woman who has either not yet won through to herself or has already lost herself again. But woman is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Woman is the world of woman. This state and this society produce feminism, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they are an inverted world. Feminism is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic and popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn compliment, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against feminism is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is feminism. Feminist suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Feminism is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of feminism as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of feminism is therefore in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which feminism is the halo. Compare and contrast that with these lines from Gerwig again. This movie is also dealing with the idea that any kind of hierarchical power structure that moves in any direction isn't so great. You go to Mattel and it's really like, oh, Barbie's been president since 1991. Barbie had gone to the moon before women could get credit cards. We kind of extrapolated out from that Barbieland is this reversed world where Barbies rule and Kens are an underclass. The reverse structure of whatever Barbieland is almost like Planet of the Apes. You can see how unfair this is for the Kens because it is totally unsustainable. Marx's line isn't dismissive of religion, it acknowledges the immense value people find in it and its very real, even its very necessary role in a world that demands its presence. Gerwig's approach to feminism is not dissimilar. The problem is, as Chesterton said, that when man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing, he becomes capable of believing in anything. Gerwig's humanist film carries in feminist assumptions in much the same way Marx's critique of religion is itself a religious statement, and Marxism itself replicated many of the major forms and functions of the religion it despises, not limited to promises of a paradise in the hereafter. But it then falls entirely flat on the most important epistemological question: what's next? What do you want? To what do you aspire? What are you for? Who are you for? What is good? And then the film has very little, if anything, to say. It says, I want no borders, I want no systems, nobody should dictate my aspirations, you shouldn't measure your worth by your achievements and your possessions can. I want to find myself, you need to find yourself. Neither of us should be defined by each other, neither of us deserves that responsibility. How will you know when you found yourself? What does finding yourself entail? How do you go about it? What will it look like once you have? Can anyone help you do it? Dunno, don't really have a clue about that one either. This is a film about motherhood. More specifically, it's a film by an anxious mother for anxious mothers. It's a film that salves itself in the comforting notion that mothers' children don't really need too much mothering. Raising a person is a fraught business. It's stressful and it's difficult. The risks are high, the stakes are vast, the consequences can be terrible to consider. Wouldn't it be easier, wouldn't it be nicer, if your child could just raise itself? If you and she could be just who you want to be, without worrying about aspirations and ideals, without worrying about direction, without worrying really about parenthood. Can't she, just like Barbie, escape the cradle and go out into the world and form her own person? Do I really need to give her some sense of purpose? In the end, this is what makes Barbie's theme and message at the same time interesting and profoundly dull. It does have interesting things to say about what it dislikes, including some aspects of traditional feminism, but it has nothing to say for itself. It presents us with no alternative. It elevates freedom over instruction in the quaint and solipsistic belief that one can exist without the other for everyone. It is, in that sense, quite profoundly selfish, but it is occasionally trying to think. It does have depth, it just hasn't charted its own depths yet. Gerwig deserves praise for its surprising complexity, even as she deserves criticism for its frequent lapses into farcical simplicity. It's incoherent because while its director lauds her own parents for what she perceives as the great freedom they afforded her as a child, she now finds herself in their place and finds the role uncomfortable. Because she misunderstands how they brought her up, she lacks a frame of reference. She's uncomfortable with the mere concept of direction. She mistakes assertions for assumptions, preaching the values of self-discovery, but relying too heavily on received opinion and the dictates of ideology, as though these are not ideology, but rather the facts of the world that you will have to navigate through. She's quite possibly misunderstood what her own parents were really about, which was not complete freedom, but a liberal education, or rather, quite a left-wing liberal education from the sounds of things. She believes she was able to form her own personhood entirely, but she doesn't understand how, as a mother, she can bestow the same gift on the child. She has Ruth Perlum step in as surrogate parent for Barbie, yet gives Ruth nothing substantive to say as a mother. Ultimately, you always need help to be yourself, and yourself is defined in large part by other people. Only once you've reached a certain age can you begin to look back and question your upbringing, but you do need an upbringing to get you to that stage. No child can say, I will discover myself. Barbie can never really leave Barbie World. You need parents to buy you the dolls. You can only later choose which to play with or not. That might have been the message of Barbie, if only it knew what it was saying. And that is the end of this video, which is much longer than I thought it was going to be. But hey, I kind of liked that one. That was fun. Gave me some things to think about. That's rarity, not something I'd have expected from a Barbie film. So, thanks to Greta Gerwig for that as well, I suppose. Don't forget to check out Pocket Champs using the link in my description or the QR code on your screen at the moment. And I will see you in the next video, folks. Ta-ra!